Come, draw close, and feel the power of the Heardstone. Your best location for Warhammer Fantasy Battle lore, hobby, and gameplay discussion. Graham McNeill. It's book 1 in the Sigmar series. We've all read it. We're ready to discuss it, and we're excited that you're here with us today. But before we jump into the book, we are going to talk a little about hobby, what's going on and everything. So how is everyone doing today?
Doing well.
Doing good.
All right. Glad to see two of you are doing well.
Doing well.
Okay, good. Kerry's in now. All right. I guess Mike.
Oh, Hot Tub Mike's in the house. Doing great.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Good. Needed a personal invitation. Got it.
Live from the hot tub.
That's right. Are you in a hot tub right now, Mike?
No, I'm in my office with my new microphone. I got it for the people because I sounded terrible the last couple episodes.
All right. Well, what's going on? What have you been working on?
For me, it's New Year, New Army. I'm still working on my Orcs and Goblins a little bit, but I've decided to join the ranks of the Dark Elves, working on some Witch Elves current. I'm doing a Witch Stars and Cauldron of Blood that I'm excited to see what it looks like all together.
And you're using the pretty traditional paint scheme on the Witch Elves from what I've seen. Is that right? What are you doing there?
Yeah, for the most part. So they're from Harganeth. It's the northernmost city, so I've got snow on the bases. And then it's just super pale, almost chilled skin with the red and the gold from the box art mostly. I'm kind of a sucker for the box art.
They're looking great so far, and I'd have to say, though, I am disappointed that you have been painting them even slower than Mike's 2 models a night. You may have to speed up on that.
I know, right?
Or what about everybody else?
I attempted to break myself out of a bit of a funk with painting by joining the Little War. Shout out to that. It's on the Discord. I set myself the lowest possible model count for completion by picking Famir, who, due to obscenely high points cost, I could manage the entire challenge in 5 models. I've yet to undercoat anything.
Well, when you're undercoating by hand, that's got to take at least half of the time that you've allotted.
Well, due to moving my home office into the hobby room, I now don't tend to psychologically want to go in there outside of work hours, which was a really bad idea.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, is anyone else working on the Little Wah? And that's Anna, who is one of the Discord users, has very graciously sponsored the Little Wah. So it's over 2 months of time, January and February. You have to paint up a 500-point army. So following the construction of whatever edition that you play, you have to paint that up. So for me, for example, I'm also taking part in that. I chose Skaven, which is the opposite of what Kerry did, which is tons and tons of models. So I have to paint up 20 Storm Vermin, 15 Plague Monks, a Rattling Gun, a Warlord, and a Doom Wheel. I have remaining 15 Storm Vermin, and Storm Vermin are my least favorite models to paint in this army. I don't know why. I love the models. They're some of my favorite Skaven models, but I'm just not enjoying painting them.
I don't know what they're called. The Skaven long rifles. Didn't you finish those recently?
That was procrastination from the Little Wah.
Got it.
I painted those instead, and I painted 6 Gutter Runners, but they deserve to be painted because they played really well against Mike in a game. They killed 5 mounted yeomen, a trebuchet, and 1 of the Pegasus Knights. So they deserved to get painted up.
Agreed.
I should say Mike still beat me. He got a dual charge with his two of his night buses onto my Storm Vermin, and they skittered away. So Mike did a great job and got that victory. Credit where credit's due.
I made a pledge for the Little Wah, which I've done nothing on. Just in a rut right now as far as hobbying goes, but I did get a game in, which was nice. We did a 6 players, 1,500 points each battle royale, and we randomly drew chaos armies. So there was like chaos demons and mortals, and what was it, Nurgle mortals, demons. There was a bunch to choose from, and I got Demons of Slanesh and did not do very well. But it was fun, nevertheless. It's always good to together with the guys and roll some dice. So.
Didn't the winds of chaos or whatever it is that you do with the magic dice, didn't that mess you over like first turn, or was it something else?
No. You might be thinking my deployment area was like boxed in by a river, and of course, as soon as I rolled it, it was a river of light. So like every unit that I had moved through and was just like getting pounded by light magic, which, as you know, is not good for demons.
No, that's not what you want to do.
That was not good. No. And then I believe 3 of the lords on the table were killed by Infernal Gateway at one point or another in the
That's what I was
battles.
thinking of.
So that was fun as well. Mine, one of the other demon players, and then I think the person who Infernal Gatewayed both of us also got Infernal Gatewayed by another player.
As is right. As is
Yeah,
right.
it was beautiful.
Well,
How long does a 6-player game last?
I think it took us 6 or 7 hours, but we're all chatting and not paying attention to the game like we should be. So
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
but it was a good time.
that's a fun part. You get to know each other, hang out with friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so for me, I've been painting Dark Elves the last year or so. I've really been painting a lot of Dark Elves. Still not really quite where I want it to be with regards to getting it on the tabletop consistently, but I've just finished painting 30 Dread Spears, and I think I'm going to have a unit of 40 Dread Spears here soon. And played a couple games, took my Bretonians out against Ryan a couple weeks ago against his new Skaven. Had a lot of fun at our FLGS. And then last weekend, I played my buddy Sean with my vampire counts and had a good time as well. It was the first time I was using a couple of models, first time using my new Vargolf, and did poorly, of course. And the other guy I was using, it was new, I think was my mounted vampire, and he didn't do anything either. So it's pretty par for the course with regards to newly painted models.
Absolutely.
It's funny how much the banner for those Dread Spears really brings the whole block together. It looks really great.
So, Mike, you're doing that pinkish color, right? It's not even purpley. It's just straight pink. What is it?
Yeah, my Dark Elves have a pink and black color scheme, kind of like a nod to Slaanesh. I kind of enjoy the lore around Dark Elves and Slaanesh and how they kind of intersect, and it's not really very well developed, but there's something there, just kind of. So I don't know. I'm going with that.
Yeah, they look great. I'd have to say I made the mistake of taking my Ethereal Slan against Mike when he first played his Dark Elves, and that was probably not great because the magic was just pretty crazily overpowering, which wasn't great for Dark Elves.
I'm learning.
Exactly. It wasn't my best choice for someone else learning their army. In other news, GW has recently released on the Warhammer community page an article telling us a little bit more about the old world. And of course, I use recently with a little bit of flexibility since we are a monthly podcast. But what did we learn? What did y'all think? Did that change anyone's minds? What's going on?
What was the most recent one? It was more details about the 3 emperors.
It was not a map.
That's right.
It was more about the time period that we would be in. Actually, I do think did it have a map? Because it was telling us about the regions of the empire that it would be covering in the old world.
I think so. I think it just showed where the home bases, as it were, of the 3 emperors. I liked it a lot. It made me hopeful that we're going to get upgrade sprues or individual units for each of the different factions, like maybe some Ulrich-themed stuff for Middenheim and some stuff for the other stuff. That would be really cool. So I hope that ends up coming to fruition.
Well, Brian, speaking of Imperial packs and what that might look like, I know that one of the users of the Discord, Cornello, asked a question specifically for Mike. Could you speculate on the release date for the old world and what will be in the starter box? Mike, can you tell us about some of that stuff?
This is never going to get old.
I feel like this is definitely something we've discussed before. I'm almost certain that you guys forced me to give some sort of prediction with regards to a release date, and I probably said like 2025 or the infinite future. Yeah, I mean they've leaned kind of heavily into the Kislev, so I feel like maybe Kislev and Warriors of Chaos, or some sort of Warriors of Chaos with like a real Norse kind of leaning to it, might be a reasonable supposition or guess. So I'll go with that. And I thought there was something that happened between now and the previous recording that made it seem like the old world might actually be coming out sooner than 2025. I think Ryan was all happy about that for some reason.
First of all, I'm going to be happy if it comes out this year because that was my prediction on our game pod or our introductory podcast, was that it would come out in 2023. And I think all of you chose 2024 if I remember correctly. So if it comes out before that for the 40th anniversary of Warhammer, I'll be sitting pretty. I don't know that that's going to happen. I mean, we're in 2023. They haven't said anything, so I'm feeling pretty soured on that. But they did say something about the 40th anniversary, and so that suggested maybe that there would be I don't know, some sort of announcements about when it would happen or what the box would be or whatever. So I'm thinking maybe we see some model previews this summer or something like that. Any other thoughts on that that announcement and what was going on?
I just like that they mentioned Talabheim, because that just means I'm ready to go with my massive Empire army.
Ooh, nice.
Oh, is yours Talabheim themed?
Yeah.
Very cool.
What was the character name of the Emperor? I can't remember what it was. It was some guy I'd never heard of, but I was like, yeah, that's my guy.
I got to be honest, I cannot keep track of empire provinces, which is probably not good for us reviewing this particular book. Can't remember. But the other thing that cracked me up and got people riled up was when they specifically said that the end times happened. So, like, signaling this isn't an alternate time. This isn't like a different timeline that's going to reset the Warhammer world, and it's going to go and it's going to go differently this time, and we're not going to have the Age of Sigmar. They were like, no, shut up, grognards. The end times happened. Age of Sigmar occurred. This is just in a period prior to that. And that cracked me up that they specifically wrote that in.
Yeah, some people got really mad. Some people got really upset. They were just like, "Oh, GW had to mention that, didn't they?"
The way it was placed and the tone of it just seemed petty. From what I recall, when I read it, when I was reading the initial release, I was just like, this is unnecessary and just seems spiteful. That was my takeaway.
Wait, Mike, are you one of the people that believes that anything GW does is specifically because they actually hate their fans? Because those people crack me up. This gaming company is doing stuff specifically to spite their fans so that, I don't know, their fans don't buy from them. It just cracks me up when people think that.
Well, I mean, it could have just been one dude. I mean, I don't know what the safeguards around Warhammer community releases are.
All right, so we kind of have an update on what's going on. Last question about hobby and stuff like that. Have there been any new models or ranges that GW has produced that you look at and you think, oh, that's going to look great in fantasy?
I'm looking forward to the Skink Light Cavalry they've just previewed, simply because I do not want to pay the current eBay prices for the Skink Light Cavalry Regiment Renown, so I'll happily pay GW prices, which, even with how high they are, will be less than those metal will be.
Yeah, those looked great. They looked fun. And they had Addles, if no one noticed that. That was pretty cool.
Is that Eensy Weensy Kerry that you're
Yeah.
referring to? Yeah. Those are classic models.
No, not since they released the Cold One Knights from like 2008.
What about the Cold One since 2008?
You were like, are you guys excited about any new models? And I was like, no, not since like the Cold One Knights released in like 2008. Those were fire though.
Oh, gotcha.
I think we can expect a Croxagore to be popping up soon. It seemed like that was the latest. I forget what it's called, but it's their hint thing that they do where they tease a model.
Oh, yeah. Their rumor engine.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Did they say in that article that was only about half the new range for Lizardmen? Yeah.
What was shown was Saurus, so new Saurus infantry, and they look beefy and fabulous. They're not nearly as serpentine as the current ones. Then they've got those Skink Cavalry that have, I think they have blowpipes, but I did not like the blowpipes. They looked like space blowpipes or something. I don't know. They were really weird. But they had Addles, which made me happy. And they showed a Slan. So in addition to the recent Croak model, they also have a new Slan in Palanquin. And that looked great. Although I think everything is sized up. Might be tough to put on a 25 mil.
Yeah, I was going to say the Saurus seemed kind of difficult to put on a 25 square just because of the tail sticks out almost as far as the body.
Yeah, it definitely needs to be some like creative use of space where some of the Saurus are angled up so that their tail is lower. Some of them are angled to the side so that, you may have to do that to get those to fit, or they may not fit at all.
The revitalization of the diagonal armies.
Oh, yeah, the diagonal slaughters. So one thing that I was really excited about, and this isn't new models, but it was something that I had never thought about using before. Someone on the Discord used some. What are they? What are the orc big guns in space? What are the 40k orcs?
Oh, the
called?
knobs.
Knobs. Thank you. Yeah. Clearly, I play 40k. I do not. Someone used the knobs, and then they like fantasized them and took away all their guns and stuff, and he used them as big guns. And they only come in boxes of 5, so I don't think I'm going to buy like 8 boxes of 5
40.
knobs to get 40 big guns of them. But I think spacing them out within some units of like the regular sized orcs from fantasy to make a unit of big guns with like some of them just being bigger with big axes and stuff, I think that's a really cool idea. And so I may try that when I get to my orcs.
Yeah, we've actually had an influx of orc players in the Discord. There's been a lot of orc posts lately. I approve.
Oh, yes.
I feel like we had a lot of Dark Elf posts. People are into it. They've heard about it. They heard HTM was into it, and they were like, we're going to get on board. Dark Elves is the way.
They were searching for the Dark Elf Discord, and naturally they were pointed in our direction.
Seen a lot of purple name tags these days.
Dark elf people, edgelords, worry me.
No. Hot to Mike and Brian are not edgelords. We are very cool.
That's exactly what an edgelord would say. But I do think it's cool. We've gotten a number of new people in the Discord. Really cool, different painting styles and different excitement. So that's really cool. So this would be a good moment to plug the Discord. If you're wondering how you can get in touch with any of us, you can do so by joining the Warhammer Fantasy The Old World Discord. We hang out there, we have fun, we chat, we talk about hobby stuff. We've got a lot of painting contests going on all the time. You can see models, you can see battle reports, you can talk tactics, or you can just shoot the breeze talking about Warhammer Fantasy. So come on down to that, and I hope that you have fun if you do so. All right. Well, I'm glad everybody's getting games in or getting some painting done or having fun. But without any further ado, we are going to jump into the no spoiler phase of Heldenhammer. So if you're someone who's thinking you may want to read this yourself and you don't want to hear all the spoilers, you're still safe. I'll let you know when we move to the spoiler phase. So let's talk about the general information. This is a book by Graham McNeill. He wrote all 3 of the Sigmar series. So this is one of 3 books. This is Heldenhammer, and then there's Empire and God King. He's also written a number of other fantasy books and some 40K Horus Heresy stuff that we're not going to spend time talking about. Has anyone read any of his other stuff?
I have not, no.
I have read The Ambassador. I guess it was 2 books, Urson's Teeth and the other one.
And The Ambassador?
It was The Ambassador and Urson's Teeth. I think those are the only 2. I don't think it's a trilogy. Yeah, I read that. It was probably 15 years ago now, though. So
what are those centered on? Are they also Empire or human centered, or are they something else?
Yeah, they're Empire centered. It tells the story of the Empire's ambassador to the court of Kislev, and all of his. He's an old general, I think, if I recall correctly, and he eventually gets called to war, but there's intrigues at court and all that type of stuff. So his thing up there in the capital.
All right. Has anyone else read any?
These are unread people, Ryan.
As I think I said maybe before we started, I think I'm the person with the least amount of lore knowledge of the Warhammer world, because I just started reading basically for this podcast. I'd read the Orion trilogy and the Stone and Steel stuff about dwarves, and that's it. Like, even when I played before, I didn't even read the lore section of most of the army books, or at least not to any great degree. So I think I'm the least lore savvy of the people here.
I think this is only the 3rd or 4th Black Library book I've read. So,
well, never mind. Evan doesn't know what he's talking about. I am vastly more knowledgeable than Evan.
May have you beat on that ignorance front.
I've read a fair few of the Black Library books. A lot of them a long time ago now, but I think the real lore people are like the people who are really into the RPG stuff. I think that's where they get a lot of their depth.
Yeah, but let's be honest. Other than Kerry, do you really want to be one of those people?
Well, I don't play RPGs, but there's a surprising amount of people on our Discord who have time for Warhammer Fantasy Battles and like 10 other gaming hobbies, and it's amazing to me because I feel like I only have time for one.
Yeah, it's impressive. Oh, it does look like we're getting Kerry back, so that's good.
Well, thank God we're saved.
Oh my goodness, we're not going to have to rely on my lore knowledge to survive this.
Apparently, I'm the
podcast.
person with the second most lore knowledge here.
Oh, Kerry's back. We made it. We're going to survive. Thank you, Kerry, for coming back.
Sorry about that.
No, we're all just excited you're here.
Okay, shall we get started while I've actually got a connection that works?
Yeah, so I just talked about Graham McNeill being the author. We talked about some of the books that he's read, and then I asked, has anyone read any of his other books? So if you want to start with that, if you've read any of his other books, you can say something there. Mike already talked about The Ambassador and Urson's Teeth.
I've read those as well and intend to reference them quite heavily when it comes to our Ride to the Dead review in 2 months.
If you've read Guardians of the Forest, Defenders of Ulthuan, or Sons of Illyrion, you can talk about those too.
All I've read of that list is those two, and then 40k, 30k stuff that we won't get into too much.
That's exactly what I said. We're not getting into that stuff. Keep that far away.
Me and Kerry don't read none of that elf book stuff.
Elf book stuff is great.
Now, Guardians of the Forest, that's about beastmen, right?
Wait, is it not? What is it about? Is there a beastman book?
There's some beastmen in this book that we just read.
Very lightly.
Not
I don't know
enough.
that there's a beastman-centered book.
There should be.
Oh, absolutely, there should be.
Well, you know what? I think that there used to be beastman book, but they destroyed them. They were like, it's a book. We have to destroy it. Yes, it's about us, but...
Their culture is not a written culture.
No. It's an abrasive culture.
Oh, geez.
Oh, boo.
Actually, I've just realised, no, there is something else of his I've read. Of Ice and Snow. It's the novella he did for the End Times. Yep. It's a sequel to The Ambassador and Urson's Teeth of a sort. And it actually has a running section where you're in the perspective of the Beastmen.
Oh, there you go. It's all come
there you go.
full circle.
You're a relatively new mutant who is basically... You're being the sidekick of Ungrel Forehorn, who is the least important Beastman special character. So, and you get such beautiful things as you're trying to give your intelligence report from spying, and he's just defecating right in front of you and sort of grinding it into the snow with his hoof.
Maybe we don't need a Beastman book.
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. All right. So in this book, Heldenhammer, that we're talking about today, who are the races involved? So if someone's interested in specific factions, what factions do we see?
It's rain and men. There are a lot of tribes of men in this book. And if you don't look at the glossary occasionally, you're going to get very confused.
Yeah, it was interesting after reading the book, you go back and cross-reference the Empire Army books from 6th, 7th, or 8th edition, and you kind of connect the dots between the provinces of the modern, I guess what was at the time the modern empire, and what the tribes were, and it's kind of the setting for our story, and tells us all about those guys.
To put this in a sort of historical lore context, we're post-War of the Beard. We're into this period where the great superpowers of the ancient world, the Elven Empire and the Dwarven Empire, have beaten each other half to death and have both pulled out of their colonies, their sort of zones of influence in what would become the Empire and Bretonnia. Within that power vacuum, the human tribes have really come into their own and are essentially replaying late Iron Age, early classical themes of state building.
I didn't even make that connection, that the power vacuum here and why like the humans are able to develop, but why there's also issues with what's going to happen, who's going to come into this power vacuum. It's not just the humans. I never made that connection that it was because of the War of the Beard and that they've all pulled out. I didn't even think about that.
I don't believe it's mentioned in the book at all because Sigmar doesn't have any of that context, I don't think.
Sigmar doesn't have any of that context, but Kurgan Ironbeard certainly does. And I've actually got quite a lot to say about what...
I don't think he ever lets on, does he?
I mean, we're going to go into spoiler territory if we go down this route. Can we come back to this?
So the people in the book don't necessarily know, or at least the humans in the book don't necessarily know why this space is given where they're developing, but then there's threats from outside. They don't know why that's happening, but I had not made that connection, and that's pretty interesting. Brian, you had something I think you wanted to say?
I was going to ask, since the War of the Beard was brought up, did the High Elves ever colonize parts of the Empire, or was it just because in Bretonia, I know they have those watchtowers along the coast where they had colonized.
So that the High Elves had a presence where Marienburg later is, and within the book, the Endels have moved out of the way of the Teutones as they've colonized into what is now the wasteland, the Westerlands, and the Endels have moved into the old elven ruins, and that's their new capital at Marienburg. There are dotted elven ruins around the Empire that occasionally come up within other novels. But if we're talking imperialistic terms, this was a soft power region between the empires of the dwarves and the elves. This isn't like Bretonia or Talia, where there were elven cities all over the place.
Okay.
Interesting.
My memory of it was the War of the Beard was set in Bretonia, basically, and the Empire didn't really see conflict between the dwarves and the elves. It wasn't really a playground of that.
Pre-Bretonia, right? I guess because Bretonia doesn't exist. But yeah, that space.
So what we have here is the dwarves getting involved in the development of what becomes the Empire, but implementing trade agreements and essentially sharing technology and boosting certain human tribes above others to try and create unity long term. This is actually quite similar to what the Wood Elves and and Liliath later do with Bretonia, except the dwarves are far more upfront about what they're doing. So your mileage may vary on, does this make the dwarves better people, or are they just doing exactly the same thing of creating this buffer zone, creating paternalistically creating allies that are going to help them long term?
Right. And for the Wood Elves, the price that the Bretoni pay is citizens killed in the Great Hunt. But for the dwarves, the price that they want is probably going to be gold later on or something like that.
At this point, the dwarves really do not have the manpower, the dwarf power, to keep up the wars against the orcs and goblins, against the Skaven. If the Greenskins colonize the old world, the Empire, forest region, the dwarves are going to lose. They are going to be surrounded by the dark clans on one side, more orcs and goblins on the other, and they will lose hold after hold. Again, this is not known by Sigmar and the human characters. This is definitely going to be in the minds of Kurgan Ironbeard and the dwarves, because what we're going to see much later on is the dwarves aligning with the humans for one final battle that doesn't actually impact the dwarves, but they tell the humans it does. The humans are under the impression this is defending the dwarven homeland. If you look at the map, it's not in any way that. So we have canonically that the dwarves are giving a very selective view of their own politics to the humans.
Yeah, see, that's not something I caught, but it does speak to, if you are interested in dwarfs, if you're interested in learning a little bit about them, this book does address them. So you've got humans in the Empire, you've got dwarfs, and then the other group that you're going to see commonly in this book is orcs, but never from their perspective. You're just going to see them as the enemy in this book.
The cannon fodder.
Absolutely.
There's also one battle with beastmen as well. I'm trying to think if there's any other factions that are represented in battles in the book, but I'm blanking on that.
Yeah, that's true. You do see a bit of those that are going to become, the Chaos Warriors, Chaos Marauder type Norse and stuff. So
sorry, it's possibly worth pointing out that the Norse and Chaos Warriors and the Orcs don't really change between what's depicted in this book and the present day in the Warhammer world. The Empire does. The Bretonians do. The Dwarves add in gunpowder down the line, but more or less the dwarves and the Norse and the orcs and goblins, you can read this and you could just do this with your army. You could depict these with what the model range has, whereas the Empire is very, very different. Humans do actually change in 2,500 years. I want to shout out, they mention the Famir as the mist demons, the mist ghosts, and it's really nice to have them mentioned.
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that.
I didn't even think about that being the Famir. And for the Norse, I think they don't change if you read them as the Chaos Marauders. I don't think they're depicted as like the super armored big baddies of Chaos Warriors, but certainly the Marauders.
Well, in the lore, like when we read Riders of the Dead, they'll talk about the Kurgan, which is like the Norse, and basically how at this time in the Empire, like the Norse are basically just kind of bad guy other humans, and they're not quite as separated as they will become in the future when the technology difference is so vast. They're still kind of tangentially related, even if they're bad guys. It's a space and a time when they're much more similar and closer together.
Yeah, maybe Kerry can correct me on this, but I believe they were a tribe like in the northern part of the Empire, and just through war were pushed across the sea to the north.
Yeah, that's in this book. I mean, if you look at the map at the beginning of this book, they're just above the Udoses, and they're connected. And then we'll talk more about this, but how they become something more separate than just one of the tribes of men that's a little bit farther north than the rest occurs in this book. So this does take place. This is about the creation of the empire. So since the imperial calendar is based on the founding of the empire, it takes place at -30, Sigmar's birth. A little bit is talked about his birth in this book, all the way to -1 of the imperial calendar. There's not actually a ton of characters that are like that you could consider main characters in this book. We'll talk more about them in just a little bit, but Sigmar is going to be who you follow. But what about if we wanted to read something that was connected to this? What would we read other than just the other two in the series?
So 2 years before this came out, Games Workshop published a lore supplement book, sort of an in-universe book called The Life of Sigmar, which covers pretty much all this material, but from a 2,000 years in the future third-party perspective, as opposed to getting inside people's heads. Now, I would not actually recommend going out and purchasing The Life of Sigmar. It is quite short. The art within it is quite disjointed. It's all woodcut style and has some very strange choices in there. But what it does is give another perspective on what Graham McNeill was trying to do and the constraints he was working within. Because things like the names of Sigmar's companions is set in stone because they'd published it 2 years earlier. The order of events is set in stone. He can't really contravene anything too much. Though I will say that there are some parts and mentions within this lore book that I really wish Graham McNeill had put into the novel. Within the Life of Sigmar book, we get some really interesting little hints about the wider world and how it was different to the contemporary Warhammer world. So we get things like the Skrianii flesh eaters mentioned as inhabiting the swamps near Reichdorf, which seem to be some sort of cannibalistic ghoul tribe, but they can't explain what they were. They just know that they existed. We also get the Uberklein, which again, cannibals, this time with red eyes, and these are things that haunt what would become the Empire and really demonstrate that you have these no man's lands between the tribes that have things that couldn't really be explained within Warhammer lore 2,000 years on. So similar to the Famir controlling big portions of the swampland, we know they sort of do in contemporary times, but there are now no-go areas that the humans don't touch, and that's a very different style. And I do wish that Graham McNeill had expanded on some of these ideas a bit more, rather than it becoming just we've got beastmen, we've got greenskins, we've got things we're used to.
Yeah, a little bit more mystical and mythical of the unknown, monsters be here type of thing.
He had a lot of a blank canvas to play with that he didn't play with.
Before we get into the spoiler phase, I do want to make sure that our listeners can know what they're in for. So if you were to describe this book in one sentence, what is this book about? Surprise! Give a one sentence summary.
It reminds me of Dark Ages uniting England, but Warhammer, kind of.
Got to add the kind of at the end.
It's someone trying to conflate the rise of Charlemagne with Samson and Conan the Barbarian without offending anybody too much.
That's a pretty fair assessment, yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of clinches it all together. It's just a unification story that takes place relatively quickly as well.
Mm-hmm. The speed of this is, I think, an important part of it, in spite of, as Mike noted when we were talking about it before, it being a 400-page book. It does seem like the events occur in pretty rapid succession.
Evan thought it moved very quickly.
So it took me 6 months to read.
I would say it's a series of trials in Sigmar gaining his goal. And in some of these, he's successful, and in others, he's disappointed. But it's about the series of trials that confront him, because the end result is never in doubt.
Wait, I got one sentence and you got that?
Sure, I cheat. I'm the one who makes the rules. Mike, you know from playing me in Warhammer Fantasy that I'm going to cheat, so you should just get used to it now.
I was going to make this great Alfred of Wessex analogy, and then I was just like limited to this one sentence, and it was horrible, but you get like...
You know, you just got to forge your own destiny, Mike.
I would argue that if Sigmar was Alfred of Wessex in this comparison, the Empire would have been a lot more unified for a lot longer in its history.
It's not a perfect analogy. Nobody said it was a perfect analogy.
All right. Well, are there any other comments in the spoiler-free section that anyone would like to tell our listeners?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. This is spoiler-free. Just kind of the Dark Ages vibe I got from the whole book, and the Welsh thing going on, but also the German thing, and also the Viking thing, and just like so many historical parallels from like the Dark Ages, 700 to 1000. You have all of these elements that you find from Dark Ages European history.
You certainly get a lot of various quote-unquote tribal groups that came after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You mentioned some of them. You see the Picts depicted. Ha ha ha. You see others as well. But yeah, each of the groups of the empire, the tribes of the empire, give a distinct feel that I think you're right, does fit with the Dark Ages.
And it's fascinating that these tribes of men unite to fight their enemies who are raiding their lands, basically. And it's very Vikings, unified forces in England and other countries coming together to fight off these invasive forces like the Norsai or the Orcs.
But the counterplay to that is, as we've mentioned, they try and cover a lot of events in quite rapid succession. Some of these tribes, they have their theme, their gimmick, and that's really all you get from them. So the tribe that is known for having berserkers, you read about their berserkers. You don't really get any nuance in there. If you are wanting to source material about the origins of your preferred Empire faction, it can be a little bit two-dimensional.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. This is not a book for understanding deep cultural ideals of particular regions of the Empire. It's not going to get you that.
They even had a region of pseudo-Amazonians that I don't feel like is present in modern Empire lore at all.
Well, I read that as the Picts.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or Boudica.
It is worth pointing out that state, I think, based on the map, later becomes Averheim. So that's Marius Lightdorf's great-great-great-great-grandma. Assuming that nothing else happens to that family within the 2,500 years.
That's where he gets the madness from.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, kind of makes sense. A little bit crazy. All right. Well, we'll get to the craziness of the book and some of the characters in it, but since we have now completed the spoiler-free section, we will be entering the Drachwald. That's our spoiler section as we discuss a lot of the stuff that happens in the book Heldenhammer. All right. So starting us off, we have book one. Book one in Heldenhammer is titled Forging the Man. And we start off just kind of meeting some of the characters. So I have this question. Who's your favorite character that we meet at the very beginning of the book?
Trinovantes.
Okay, why?
Because he's the only one that seems relatively sensible and doesn't appear to be named after a garden implement. For a bit of context, I've already said that Graham McNeill was a bit written into a corner with the names already being chosen for him. So we have this weird selection of names. So on the friends we have Pendrag, which is basically the name Pendragon from Arthurian mythology with the last syllable cut off. And we have Wolfgart, who, as far as I can tell from searching the internet for things called Wolfgart or similar, appears to be Wolfgarten gardening implements with the last syllable cut off. The EN really wasn't liked by whoever was doing these names.
Never change, TW. Never change.
So Trinovantes is definitely my favourite because he has at least a full name, not this sort of weird truncated name. And he doesn't do anything offensive or stupid later down the line.
Good enough reasons to like Trinovantes. Who else has a favorite?
Yeah, I don't know that I had a favorite. Wolfgart is another one of Sigmar's best friends who we meet at the beginning. And he is kind of the sidekick who is probably the most powerfully built type of guy, the type of guy who's more headstrong and brash and combative than maybe some of the other friends who are more diplomatic, or Trinovantes, who I had as kind of the middle of the road with regards to those virtues or qualities. So Wolfgard's kind of your barbarian, big guy, brash, wants to fight, kind of loud type of guy, and he'll be with Sigmar here throughout the rest of the book.
I described him as big, loud, and braggadocious.
We also get introduced to Alaric, who, if you know your lore, is Alaric the Mad, the legendary dwarf runesmith, who appears to be doubling up as an engineer in this. Whether this is trying to imply that the Engineers Guild and the runesmiths profession split later on, or whether it's just trying to fudge it a bit, let's not go into. But what we get is a dwarf who's decided or been ordered to upgrade the humans' Bronze to Iron Age time tribal to Dark Age kingdom in technology.
Yeah, he appears to be the main link at this time between the tribes of men and what comes to be known as the Empire and the Dwarf Kingdom.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later, but he is the main link, but it doesn't seem to be entirely of his own volition. There seems to be, he's going there for a reason. He's maybe not got orders to go there, but there's some connection to the High King or to someone else, perhaps.
There's a couple more characters I think we'd be remiss not to mention at the beginning. Sigmar's father, King Bjorn of the Unberogans, is an important character in the first couple of books of this novel.
Yep.
And he's the grandson of Redmane Dregor, and they seem to have a long lineage of being the rulers of the Unberogans. King Bjorn has a bannerman, Alfgeir, and he's also an important character who helps serve Sigmar in his quest to unify the tribes.
I'd say for me, maybe not my favorite, but I see Pendrag, who's also one of Sigmar's kind of right-hand man. He's his bannerman and that kind of thing. He's just solid and loyal. He's described as more thinking than Wolfgart. He considers moral aspects and principles maybe a little bit more than the others, and a little bit more phlegmatic, perhaps.
There's a couple minor characters as well. Very early on, we get introduced to Cuthwin and Wenold, and what stood out to me about it was just like, I was like reading it and I was like, this seems like a couple of Welsh names just kind of thrown into the middle of all of this, kind of German stuff. And it was just very bizarre to me to these random kind of ancient English, ancient Welsh dudes thrown in there.
They're the scouts.
Yeah.
A young boy who becomes a scout. Brian, did you have one of the others that you wanted to introduce?
Yeah, he kind of hits his stride later on, and maybe it's because I'm kind of more familiar with his deeds in the next book, Empire. But Garon obviously we have to remember him as he plays a pretty important role in the life of Sigmar, and then his eventual change later on in the book.
He's the brother of Trinovantes, the twin brother,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, the twin brother of Trinovantes, and also they're both the brothers of Ravana.
And the fact that in our list of main characters, this is the first female and the only female we're going to get says a little bit about the gender balance within this novel.
This character, who's never actually named, the old lady of Breckenwalsh, also plays a pretty interesting and heavy role in the shaping of Sigmar.
Just to set the scene for the people, when we first are introduced to Reichdorf, it's pretty small, and as the book progresses, it exponentially grows and gets bigger and stuff. So at this time, the tribes are pretty isolated from each other, and Reichdorf, which eventually becomes Altdorf, is still like pretty much a village at this point. Maybe the most prominent that there is, and the hall was built by the dwarves there, and it's the nicest thing they got going for it, but it's still pretty primitive.
It's probably also mentioning that at our starting point, Sigmar is 15. We're going to get flashbacks to earlier, but Sigmar is 15, and we should probably remember that as context for how the next few sections are going to play out. They had played around with the timeline a little bit. We aren't going to see chronologically him saving Kurgan Ironbeard and getting the Hammer of Sigmar, which really should have happened after Asterthorn Bridge, but they've put it before so that he already has the hammer and we don't have to have the wow, this is amazing, it can just auto destroy things moment.
Got it. So one thing that Mike was getting at right before we get to Asterthorn Bridge, finishing off kind of connecting us to stuff, is that what is going to be the Empire during the times of 6th to 8th editions of the Warhammer world, what's going to be the Empire is completely divided into small, warring, tribal groups, each with their own territory, sometimes with some sort of kinship or bond relationships, but not really. They're pretty ununified and combative towards one another.
I believe they have shared religion for the most part, too. They seem to mostly worship Ulrich, from what I can tell.
Who wouldn't? They don't have, from the very flat depiction of the cultures, they don't seem to have a ton of cultural stuff connecting them. And so, there's the religion and they're human.
A couple of tribes that are in closer proximity will have better relationships, like Marburg and the Endals with the Reichdorf and the Umberogans.
And we also never have a language issue, which shows there's a certain cultural unity going on.
Oh, that's very true. All right, so we've got these characters. What's our introduction to who Sigmar is?
So Sigmar is put in charge of an army to go out and save a town that is besieged by orcs. And this is going to be our introduction to Sigmar the hero, Sigmar the prince, Sigmar the warrior. And it's going to be his testing his mettle, demonstrating his leadership ability, which he does straight off by deciding to not wear any armor because, good leadership there.
He'll actually get critiqued for that kind of stuff later. You see him grow a little bit, like learning about how to be a leader without being a naked man in front of the battle lines. And yet you also see some continuity with that throughout the book. But before you talk about what happens at the battle, I think one of the things that's interesting is Geryon is kept out of the battle because he had a fight with Wolfgard. And so he doesn't actually get to go to the battle. And it would be his first battle. And it seems like it's going to be really most of the main male fighting characters of Sigmar's group. It's going to be all their first battle where they're going to prove themselves as men and come to some sort of camaraderie. But Geryon doesn't get to go.
Yeah, and it's noted that Geryon is probably the finest swordsman amongst that class of young men.
But he still gets beat up by Wolfgard because Wolfgard's bigger.
What we have is quite a basic tactical plan, which we can critique all we like, of we will send our cavalry to attack the orcs, we will then pull our cavalry back, and then we will charge the orcs again once we've swapped our spears out for ones that aren't broken.
Except this relies on a really important kind of requirement from a certain group of people.
Which is the volunteer 50 to 100 men who will then block the bridge you've just ridden across to give you time to get rearmed. And that contingent is essentially going to sacrifice themselves heroically. It's one of these things where it was already in the law that this happened, and Graham McNeill couldn't change it. If you think too hard about this, you'll start picking holes in it quite quickly. There are ways of doing this exact maneuver that doesn't involve sacrificing a contingent. The best way of thinking about it is Sigmar's 15. This is the best he got.
Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking. He's been left to test his mettle, but also his leadership skills. But the book doesn't directly say, like, oh, this was a mistake. Oh, he shouldn't have done this. The reader has to fill this in themselves if they want to.
And the book doesn't necessarily come down on it as a mistake. It comes down on it as this is an important watershed moment for leadership skills. It's almost Churchill deciding to let Coventry get bombed. This is a necessary sacrifice. Don't read into it too hard or you're going to start questioning it. Just as Gerion's about to, because Trinovantes just got killed heroically. And was it necessary?
I mean, not to step on that reveal there, but you have 3 Texans here, so rather than Coventry and Churchill, you may want to say the Alamo, because that's the one that we're going to be used to.
Remember
someone
that?
Sacrificing. So let's just go with the Alamo. It's just safer. We'll just go.
Was there a leadership decision to sacrifice the Alamo as necessary?
Yeah, yes, I would say so. Absolutely.
I mean, we all remember, right?
We do remember, and we also remember the come and take it canon. But no, there was a leadership decision, a recognition that the Alamo had to be sacrificed to some degree to allow forces to be gathered, and that leads to the Battle of San Jacinto here in Houston, the town where 3 of us are, or 2.5 of us are.
Do you want to just cut the whole Coventry bit, and do you want to...
Oh, no, I was just saying it for interesting reasons. I think Coventry works really well. I just wanted to add that Texas has the Alamo.
Okay.
Wait, that's in Texas? So we were reading Heldenhammer, right?
Good point, Evan. We were reading Heldenhammer. As Kerry stated, Trinovantes defends the bridge to allow extra time, but has to sacrifice his own life. Did anyone have anything else on Astafan Bridge that they wanted to say on the battle in particular?
Yeah, I was going to just mention that Trinovantes had seen an omen of his death, and that's kind of a theme that kind of runs throughout this novel, that people see signs and omens and this ancient way of viewing the world. So Trinovantes had seen an omen of his death.
There was a crow, right? At the very beginning of the book, he sees a crow.
Something like that, and then maybe he sees it again at the battle. And then also I was going to mention that it also speaks to the logistics I was talking about earlier with regards to, like, I think Reichdorf at that time had about 2,000 people, and I think Sigmar goes out with like about 200 men, and so that kind of gives us a understanding of kind of like the population size and kind of the numbers we're dealing with at this point, and we see how that changes over time.
Yeah, Graham McNeill works to make sure that we know the numbers of men at each of the battles. Like, he's always like, there's 3,000 men at this battle or whatever. And I think you're right, Mike. That's to kind of give us an idea of what we're dealing with and what this expansion looks like. And early on, it's really low.
Yeah, it's really low, like a few hundred, but by the end of the novel, we see what that turns into.
We get the returning heroes. We get Sigmar getting celebrated. Sigmar is, of course, in a great melancholy. And I'm just going to slight divergence to a comparison I already made. Sigmar is 15. This is the same age that Conan the Barbarian becomes a man and has his first battle. We're going to be spending most of our time in, to quote Robert E. Howard, great melancholies as opposed to great mirth. He spends a lot of time introspecting and beating himself up about everything he does. Gerion, who's been left out of the battle, is all judgment. I got my twin brother killed, and it causes a scene, and is clearly going to be in an antagonist role from now on, because you can see in his head that he's not going to let this go.
What is everybody else thinking? What happens when they get back that might help us understand, foreshadow things in the future, or would be important for understanding things that happen in the future?
We're really getting the impression that Sigmar and Ravenna they are a couple, and they are going to be a thing quite soon. they're going to, get married within the next few years.
I can't remember when she says it, but like, obviously she's torn. She's super upset that her brother has died. She doesn't blame Sigmar for Trinovante's death in the same way that Geryon does. And this in spite of the fact that she's really very pacifistic. Like, she's upset that they have to go to war. She's upset that all these things happen, but she's not as torn up about the specifics of that her brother was sacrificed.
Yeah, she seemed very quickly to forgive Sigmar, and I don't want to say move on, but kind of move on a little bit. Whereas Garon just really, he kind of takes it harshly, to put it lightly.
If I recall correctly, they're orphans. Is that right?
Yeah.
Does that have something to do with why, like, when Sigmar's talking, and maybe this is jumping too far forward, but Sigmar is going to talk about marrying her later, but he says he's going to wait until he's king. I wonder if that has to do with her lineage.
No, it has nothing to do with their lineage. If it had to do with their lineage, then Trinovantes wouldn't have been put in command position. This has to do with, to put it bluntly, Sigmar being an idiot. You cannot put off marriage until you are king in a Dark Age society. 15 is a perfectly acceptable marriageable age if you're a monarch in a Dark Age society. We're going to jump 10 years in the future and he's still putting off the wedding. The way I had to read this was that Sigmar didn't actually want to get married, and as we've joked about on the Discord, was Sigmar in fact in love with Wolfgar or something like that, and just they didn't have the audacity to say this outright.
One other key here is that there's also a play on his marriage to the ideal or the dream of what he's supposed to make. Right. At the very end of the book, it talks about what he's supposed to be married to, or maybe it's in the middle of the book, but he's talking to the hag at one point, and she reminds him, like, you're supposed to be married to the idea of an empire, of unity, of the land. And so I do think that he kind of knows that, and so he may be putting off the marriage to her because he knows he's not really supposed to. He's supposed to do this other thing, and that's supposed to be his true love.
That sounds like the Frederick the Great excuse. To me, Sigmar is Alexander in this. He's going to get married because he has to, not because he wants to.
Possible. We do get at the very end of this some foreshadowing that really doesn't last long, that it's a surprise, but Geryon goes to the hag at the very end of this section of the book, and we don't see it, but he's going to make some sort of deal with her, and we don't know what it is, but we know he's angry at Sigmar.
Well, at this time, Bjorn is visited by the Witch of the Brackenwash after Trinovante's funeral. The witch tells Bjorn he must make a vow to her. She won't tell him what it is yet, but he must promise to obey what she commands in the future.
When they talk about his birth, was there something about the hag woman being there at his birth as well?
The original hag woman had been boiled and eaten by the orcs when they got there to receive rudimentary midwifery help. So Sigmar gets born on a battlefield, covered in orc blood, as his mother dies giving birth to him. The hag woman we therefore have for the rest of the story is her apprentice who watched all this happen.
It's very Conan as well.
And also, after the funeral of Trinovantes, this is kind of the formative moment when Sigmar makes Wolfgard and Pendrag swear to him that, we're going to have this oath together to unite the tribes of men, because Sigmar's had this clear vision after the Battle of Asaphan Bridge that the tribes of men must unite or they will separately, be destroyed by the forces of beastmen and orcs. So this is kind of where Sigmar's vision of the future and what has to be done kind of is developed.
There's no clear moment of having a vision or anything. Am I remembering that wrong? I don't remember him having a specific vision, someone telling him he had to do this. It's just more like Sigmar believes that we have to do this and he's making everyone swear. And then throughout the book, there's just this confidence that that's what has to be done. And everyone knows he's the one to do it. And you get little glimpses of why people believe in Sigmar. And he's obviously the best fighter and he's obviously strongest and he has Galmaraz. And later we'll get to the story about how he gets the hammer. But it's interesting because he's got this confidence that this is what he has to do. And then everyone believes he's going to do it. but you don't always know why people think he's so great.
We can get into it later, but that would be one of my criticisms of the book.
It's a drawback of trying to fit so many different plot beats in. They haven't actually got space for, or breathing space for him to convince anyone with actions. They're going to have to tell, not show on this.
Evan, go ahead and tell us what you're thinking on that.
Well, he has this clear idea of his destiny, and there's moments early on in the book, and I think we're about to get to a point pretty soon where this shifts, where early on he has doubts about this sort of vision of his for the future. And then there's a very clear-cut moment, and then you don't really get those doubts after that. And it's kind of something we just were talking about, and like I said, we will get into it. But it's kind of that dichotomy of, his vision for this empire, and he never strays from it, and he never has like moments of doubt later on. Which I just as a criticism, I think it makes the book less compelling at times, because you just feel like you're working through like these plot beats. Like you're just waiting for like the next one to come. You know?
So the melancholy that Kerry talked about earlier, it's not a melancholy of, did I make the right choice? Am I sacrificing these things for nothing? It's a melancholy of, boy, it's a bummer I had to sacrifice these things, but it's all going to work out because I know I have this destiny.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that is one of the, and I think Kerry's right that it's because this book is trying to do so much in a relatively, 400 pages short story, but it's that difficulty of writing a book when everyone knows what's going to happen at the end, and then the characters, and then you add to it that the characters know what's going to happen, and that's tough.
I think it was a poor decision overall to get inside Sigmar's head for this book. Black Library later gets better at this sort of thing with the Horus Heresy books, getting inside Primarch's heads, and how do you depict the inner thoughts of someone that is a larger-than-life character. But really, I think they should have gone down the route they took with the Solar Macarius trilogy and done this mainly from a third-party perspective, and therefore you wouldn't have to look at Sigmar's thought processes. It would be, how does this look from the outside?
Yeah, because you kind of get this tension of like the legendary figure of Sigmar, and then like the reality, but there's no tension there between those things. They're just one and the same,
You don't get to rely on the unreliable narrator because he's inside his own head. You don't have any of those things that you can rely on. It's, here's a larger than life character who believes he can do larger than life things and is going to go do them.
And you could have gone down the like Caiaphas Cain route. I'm using Black Library examples for obvious reasons, where this could be told by sort of a 70-year-old Sigmar who's almost at the point of walking off into the sunset, and him critiquing, this is what people said happened, this is actually what really happened. We could have had some fun with that.
I think that would have been really interesting, actually. Yeah, him kind of looking back on it through the lens of his wisdom that he's gained.
Well, historical memory is always an interesting thing, right? Like the way that we choose to remember events like the bombing of Coventry or the Alamo or the Battle of Astafan Bridge and Sigmar's actions. But what we do know is that Sigmar does win this battle. Sigmar is someone who believes himself destined for a great future. We see some foreshadowing of events with his father Bjorn meeting with the hag and having to offer, obedience essentially to her for Sigmar's life. And then, of course, Gary ongoing as well. So we see this foreshadowing, and that leads us into this book 2 of Heldenhammer, part 2, which is the forging of the king. And in it, we see Bjorn getting ready for battle.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wrote down in my notes that this is a 6 year time jump. So now we have Sigmar about age 21. And right at the end of book one, there's also a point where Bjorn tells Sigmar that it's better to dip out as king as opposed to become frail and destroyed by your enemies. And that kind of foreshadows Sigmar's famous end in the Warhammer world, which I thought was notable and interesting. The book two starts out with Sigmar leading his warriors against a group of beastmen. Garyon is with him, and Garyon at this time has become Sigmar's friend over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, ostensibly. And the book speaks to how Garyon is a very fine swordsman. And at the same time, Reichdorf is expanding very quickly. It has new dock facilities and bridges are going up over the Reich River. Wolfgard is developing war horses. And so we're just seeing kind of a steady progression and development in Reichdorf and amongst the Umberogen tribe.
One thing that is going to come up now and later is some of these socio-economic changes, these changes to infrastructure, things like horse breeding as well, they aren't necessarily possible within the time frames the novel gives.
Yeah, everything's kind of on an accelerated timeline.
To breed decent war horses, you need to go through several generations of horses. They're going to manage that. They've started it in 6 years. They're going to have more or less perfected it in 15. That isn't generally the turnaround of that.
Maybe the gestation period of a Warhammer World horse is like 15 minutes. I don't know. They're like fruit flies, and Wolfgart is like Mendel.
So this is why the Bretonnians cheat and just interbreed with elven steeds every few generations.
Smart.
The Bretonnian war horses, not the Bretonnians themselves.
That's how you get beastmen.
All right. So we come back. So they fought beastmen. And then, like, there's a couple things that are happening all at once, right? Like,
before you move on from the beastmen, I did want to mention, just in my notes, it says, Bray shaman must be so disappointed in their herds. Because I feel like the Bray shaman was extremely powerful, but was totally let down by his herd of gore or whatever they were, just fleeing from the battle.
I can tell you that there are some Bray shaman podcast editors who are similarly disappointed in their herd regularly. If you catch my drift. No, y'all are awesome. I think it's true. Beastmen, we talked about this, them not having a book. It's sad. Like, they don't even get to be like the super big baddies. They're like the rats in the cellar of your RPG game. They're just like the first baddie you meet, and they're disposed of fairly easily. It's true in the Orion series. Like, they do the same thing to them. Like, the Beastmen aren't much.
They're not a writing culture, Brian. They can't have books.
But they can still, like, destroy stuff. They should still be.
They're
super
like cave
big
paintings. They're like cave paintings at best.
Mike, do you think the orcs have books?
No. Are we reading their stories?
There's Skarsnik.
Well, I mean, we're only reading this. They're in the men's stories, but are we reading like the stories from the orcs' perspective?
I assume Skarsnik is from a goblin's perspective.
I haven't read it. I'll have to get back to you on
It's
that.
on the list. It's on the list. But okay, before we get too far off topic, so there's a couple things happening all at once, and I could be wrong on the timing, but I think Bjorn goes to the north to fight the Norsey.
He goes to the north to fight the Norsey because the Norsey are pushing into the Udozas, I believe. That becomes one of the first major conflicts that we're introduced to in this next section of the Norsey pushing south.
Yeah, and at that same time, we also have the plot point where Garyon, he's visited by the witch in the Brackenwalsh, and then at some point while he's back in Reichdorf, he sees his sign that now's about the time to take his revenge for his brother's death. And so he sees the red hand at a training session when someone's wounded by accident. and that's his sign that he needs to take revenge. And so King Bjorn's up in the north fighting the North Sea at the same time that Gerion's getting ready to take his revenge on Sigmar, and kind of these fates are kind of coming together here at this moment.
Yeah, I think McNeill had a really difficult thing here because he has to take Gerion from hating Sigmar, really angry about Trinovantes, and then portray Gerion as now he's a friend of Sigmar, and no, he's definitely over things, and all is well. And then he sees the sign that he was supposed to see. He's supposed to be a little bit torn about it. Maybe he's torn. We don't know. Maybe he doesn't really want to do it, but what's going on? It's a really hard thing to do in such a short number of pages for the book. That's a really tough spot for Graham McNeill to be in.
This is sort of writing around a time jump difficulty that you see a lot, where you need to pick up this narrative thread very quickly and show internal conflict when you really don't have the breathing space to do it.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I did notice one thing in there when he's meeting with the hag. When he's talking to her, I do get this question of like, who's leading Gerion and who's leading the hag? Because we know the future for Sigmar, and in this book we don't know the future for Gerion yet. Even at this point, I wrote down in my notes, who does the hag serve? Right? Like, because sometimes she seems to be serving men, like when she's dealing with Bjorn and Sigmar. Well, not Sigmar yet, but when she's dealing with Bjorn. But is Tzeentch back there pulling some strings? Like, I wonder how much Tzeentch is there. I don't know if anyone else got that feeling.
I always got the vibe of she was always on the side of men, and that her pushing Gerion to, the links that he goes to was all part of the character building or the trials that Sigmar had to go through to end up becoming Sigmar, God King.
Right. I always felt that she was definitely on the side of men, but I wasn't sure if there was someone behind her tricking even her. Like, where do these powers come from? Could it be Tzeentch?
Well, this sort of takes us conveniently into the next scene, where Gerion is going to surprise his Sigmar and his sister in their sort of secret little glade, all Braveheart style. You go off into the woods to have your romance, and his plan for revenge is to stab Sigmar and then murder his sister, because that makes total sense.
Wait, just to clarify, he wasn't intending to kill his sister, was he?
I didn't get that vibe.
I didn't think so.
I thought he just kind of did it on a whim.
I got the impression that he hadn't taken it off the table when he popped out.
I thought it just ended up being a mistake.
Either way, he kills her. That's the important thing.
He jumps out, and Sigmar's obviously not ready for battle and doesn't have his weapon, and knows that Gerion is this super skilled swordsman, and he doesn't have much of a shot. And ultimately, he gets beat, and he only survives by falling into the water, the nearby river, and Gerion has killed his own sister, Ravina, and right in front of Sigmar, as Sigmar, kind of dying, floats away in the river.
And what we have here is the death of the only female main character, in such a way that her death really only exists to inspire change in the male protagonist. People who are familiar with comic book analysis would know this as women in fridges, where you kill off the female love interest, really not treating them as a person, just treating them as a narrative device to add character growth and angst to the male. This is not necessarily something you want to see in your fiction, and isn't something you really want to be relying on as a plot device.
Yeah, which that was kind of what I was hinting at earlier with my criticism, is that pretty much from this moment on, he doesn't doubt. It kind of frees him to pursue that destiny.
Right.
Like, he doesn't have that tension anymore between, like, oh, do I want to be married and be the king in, this way, versus like, oh, I'm going to go be the warrior king now.
Right. Because she served for him also as a kind of conscience about war.
Right.
This struck me as odd. I find it odd that in the Warhammer world that there would be anyone being like, maybe we shouldn't fight. Okay, in our world, I get it because you're fighting other humans. But in the Warhammer world, these are orcs, and orcs just wants to fight and kill everything, and beastmen the same, and dark elves fairly similar. You have to fight. And I don't know, like her just saying, I really wish that the men wouldn't have to go fight, which I get, wishing that they wouldn't have to go fight. But also, is that even a comprehensible thought in a world where if you don't, you die?
Yeah, I had that same thought while I was reading.
Do you have academics sitting around discussing what is a just war when the chaos spawn are on the other side of the gate?
Exactly. I just don't think that the Warhammer world has a place for pacifism.
It's in the name.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah, and at about the same time, we have King Bjorn up in the Trucen lands fighting a Northside invasion. He's got about 7,000 warriors with him, mostly Inberugans, but also Trucens. The eve before the battle, he's visited by the Witch of the Brackenwald, and she kind of reminds him of, after Trinovanti's funeral, that she required that he promise her that he would obey her when the moment kind of came. And she visits him and tells him he has to go out and fight the fearsome warlord of the Northside tribe um, at the battle tomorrow. This is kind of a culmination of the sacrifice that is necessary for the passing of Bjorn onto Sigmar, and death and fate, and all of these things kind of intertwining here.
He knows he has to sacrifice and do whatever it is that she says in order to save Sigmar. And he doesn't know what's happened back at home, but he knows that that was the deal. He obeys her, Sigmar will be saved.
And this narrative element will definitely not be undermined by reusing it again before the end of the book. No more father figures are going to have this exact conversation.
So he fights this warlord and is struck down, but doesn't die. He's injured grievously. And I didn't mention this in the combat with Sigmar and Girion. The reason that his injury is so harmful is that Girion had put poison on his blade. And so when Sigmar is found, on the bank of the river, he's got this deadly poison in him that's definitely going to kill him. And at the same time, however many miles away, his father Bjorn is also kind of on a deathbed, or maybe not a deathbed, but is injured, not necessarily in a way that's going to absolutely lead to his death.
Yeah, so simultaneously, Sigmar is found by a fisherman whose name is Horst Edsel. Shout out to Horst. And he's taken back to the apothecary in Reichdorf. And at this exact kind of simultaneous moment, a 12-hour period, Bjorn is up in the north, and he's been struck down. And that's when it leads us to Bjorn and Sigmar finding each other in this area known as the Grey Vaults. So Sigmar and Bjorn meet each other in the Grey Vaults when they're both kind of on death's door. Sigmar and Bjorn are reconciled there. They don't really understand why they're there, and they start making their way towards distant mountains. And Bjorn and Sigmar fight a battle in these Grey Vaults, this kind of Twilight Zone where they fight a host of demons and ghosts, and the Inberogan ghost men kind of help them fight these demons. They're kind of in this in-between space between life and death, and Bjorn wants to send Sigmar back to the land of the living, of course, and Bjorn then has to sacrifice himself and goes to Mor's kingdom, and this kind of opens up the path for Sigmar to take over the tribe of the Umberogan when he's about 21 years old or so,
right,
and fulfill his destiny of uniting the tribes.
Sigmar is supposed to be the one who dies, and Bjorn's not necessarily supposed to die, right? But he sacrifices himself.
Do you think this was a quick way to give Sigmar closure over Bjorn, while at the same time passing the mantle of leader of the Umberogans?
Well, I mean, as Kerry said earlier, there's also the foreshadowing of like you want to pass it on and not like die in old age, and so I do think part of it is that, and then part of it is it's a nice way of setting it forward that that's how the mantle gets passed. He's already had one super sad thing when Ravina dies. We don't need a second one of his father dying to drive him to build the empire. His father sacrificing and believing in him, just as Ravina had, I think is enough. After Sigmar starts to recover, right? So like his father's sacrifice works. He comes back. He's alive. He fights and survives. And we move into book 3, which is called Forging the Legend. And in Forging the Legend, Sigmar, who's now king, has the opportunity to say to his swords brother, his sworn swords, we're going to now accomplish my vision. And McNeill wastes no time in having him start to do that. Does anyone want to? There's a number of things that Sigmar does now, right? Like his goal is to unite men. That's what he wants to do. It's what he said he wants to do. And he says, we've got to unite men because, the enemies are too many and too powerful, and we're all going to die if we don't unite, specifically orcs, but I guess beastmen might be in there to some degree too. We have to unite, and he's going to be the one to unite them. But the tribes, their kings are just like, they're fractious. They fight each other. They don't want to unite. They want their independence, all those tropes, and he has to bring them together. Much of book 3 is him on this, doing these number of heroic feats to bring about unity. So rather than like go through each of these, who has a favorite that they want to talk about? We could kind of try to go in order. Who's got one they want to talk about?
One quick thing I think we should mention, though, is I believe at the beginning of the 3rd book, he's kind of like coronated as the king of the Umberogan, is he not?
Yeah, all of them get together. I think all the kings, or most of the kings.
Or at least the ones that are allied to him.
Well,
already.
They get together for Bjorn's funeral.
Right.
Right.
And then at the end of his funeral, he is, I believe he's like kind of coronated.
Right.
Then. And then one fun scene is when King Kurgan, the Dwarven king, kind of reiterates the story of how he obtains Galmaraz, which Kerry had talked about earlier, that it's kind of out of place in the story.
Right. And just
I don't know
before you tell the story of how he gets it, it comes about because he's trying to like convince the kings to unite, and they're not interested in doing so. And so he says, I can't remember exactly what he says about Galmaraz, but like something about like him getting Galmaraz or him choosing it or something like that. And the Dwarf King very swiftly like corrects him and says, no, you didn't choose Galmaraz. It chose you.
So you could almost consider that retelling of that story like the first of the trials that kind of convince the other kings to unite behind him.
He gets Galmaraz because he fights a battle in which the Dwarfen king is tied up and captured.
Kerry, did they describe it much in the brief thing that you said was published before this book?
There's a few versions of this. It is in the Life of Sigmar. It's put narratively at a different point in Sigmar's life. It's after Asterthorn Bridge. Really, the plot beats aren't that different. There's some very straightforward things that appear in every version of this story.
Is this idea of the hammer choosing him? Because it's the Dwarf King Kurgan. It's his hammer, and Sigmar's fighting the orc leader in Vagraz Head Stomper. Because if you have an orc name, you've got to read an orc name. Vagraz Head Stomper. And they're fighting, and the dwarves are tied up with good dwarven rope, and that's how you know they can't get loose. And they are in danger, and Sigmar goes to save them, in spite of the fact that like the orcs are probably going to kill the humans too, and that's why Kurgan's surprised. And they start fighting, and Kurgan gets loose, and the others get loose, and they're fighting or whatnot. But Sigmar's fighting Vagraz, and Kurgan gets this idea he has to throw Galmaraz to Sigmar, and he knows he has to throw it to him, and he throws it to him, and Vagraz suddenly gets like surprised. He's like, oh, crud, I was beating this human, and now this human has this hammer, and things aren't so great. And then he smacks Vagraz around, and even though he doesn't stomp on Vagraz's head, he does crush it with a hand.
I was very quickly trying to reread the Life of Sigmar section to make sure I get this right. No, it's a very straightforward. He saves the Dwarf King. Dwarf King gifted Sigmar with his great hammer, and the hammer isn't mentioned until the saving's finished.
Right. In this book, in Heldenhammer, it's very specifically that Kurgan points out at this moment, like, the hammer chose him. And this is one of those moments where everyone needs to believe in Sigmar because he's something special. The dwarves say so.
The next section we have is Sigmar returns to the north to essentially replay the war that his father died in, and this time beats the Norsi so hard that they are in full flight via boat. If we sort of think all the long ships are taking off half empty of men, except this time it's catapults on the cliffs, let's wipe them out as they flee. And there is some debate among Sigmar's companions as to whether this is beyond the pale. Are we into war crime territory now? Is this a bit genocide-y? And Sigmar is, no, this has to be done, this is necessary, puts his foot down, no, we are doing this, this is for the good of the empire that will be.
Yeah, this is one of those moments when Pendrag, his contemplative side, comes out, and he's thinking about, oh my goodness, are we really doing this? And at the end, after Sigmar tells him, like, no, this is why we're doing it, because they're going to come back. If we don't do this, they're going to come back and attack us again and again and again. So we have to do this. Pendrag kind of comes to a point where he's like, I know he's right, but I don't want to be here for it. And I'm going to leave. And I don't want to be involved.
This might be a bit too political, but in reading this, as a British person, this felt very much like the debates about the sinking of the Belgrano in the Falklands War. It's technically leaving the combat zone. Is it a fair target, given it could turn around again? And Sigmar versus Pendrag, it felt like the debate about that. It was a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that debate at all, hence why cut it if it's too obscure.
No, I'm familiar.
I'm all about obscure references to military conflicts between UK and Argentina. One thing I thought was interesting about this is, in spite of this book having a lot of battles between, Sigmar's forces and others, this is one we don't see. So I just thought it was interesting that, like, here's a battle with the Norsi, and it may just be because we just saw one with Bjorn in the Norsi, and how do you describe that same battle, but this time with Sigmar? But it was interesting.
Yeah, as Kerry said, it kind of had the genocide vibes, but as we know, as we move on in Empire history, with most of the Black Library books and in the lore, the main chaos enemy of the Empire a lot of the time is the Norse. It's marauders, it's Kurgan, it's guys. These are a large part of the main enemy of the Empire later on in history. And so they're clearly not successful in any type of genocide attempt. And interestingly, I think from differentiating the tabletop from the lore, you don't see marauders a ton necessarily on the tabletop, but in the lore, marauders they're prominent. They're there.
Mike, if I could just clarify, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. Kurgan and Norse aren't interchangeable. Kurgan are actually a separate peoples from across the World Edge Mountains. This is going to be very relevant in Rise of the Dead. Writers tend to like using Kurgan later on in Storm of Chaos material because they've not been done to death. They want more of a steppe culture than a Norse culture.
Interesting.
Oh, interesting. My apologies.
Are Kurgan more horse related?
Kurgan are basically a combination of Proto-Turkish, little bits of Hun, but really steppe pastoral horse nomads. In the present, the main leader of the Kurgan is Crom the Conqueror, which brings us back to Conan, where we're using names straight out of Robert E. Howard.
Hey, if you can't do better than another writer, just steal their ideas and put them in the Warhammer world. It'll work.
If you look at the maps that show sort of the Chaos Wastes and the tribes around them, there's three broad categories. You've got the Norse, you've got the Kurgan, and you've got the Hung, which are above China. Cathay, sorry.
So, yeah, we have this ethnic cleansing. Even if not a genocide, this is certainly an ethnic cleansing. So if you're looking at the map, and the map comes in the book, the Norse flee from where they are, and the Udosis are rescued and brought into Sigmar's fold as allies of this burgeoning organization of men that includes, and this is something we haven't talked about, it's not just the Unbrogen who are doing this fighting. Bjorn himself had actually created a couple of alliances.
I think up in the north, it's the Cherusins who he's fighting with when he's fighting the Norse.
And then there's Marabad of the Endals, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, more bad.
This is one right beside him that he's allied with. Where are the Cherusins? I don't even know where they are.
The Cherusins are in like modern day Hawkland. They're kind of right.
That doesn't help me. I don't know my lore.
Okay.
Oh, geez.
Well,
okay, they're right in the middle. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right. So I get to play the ignorant lore reader who is listening to this podcast. You can understand where I'm coming from saying I don't know where this is. But this is right in the middle of what's going to become the Empire. Okay. Bjorn had already created those allies, so they're helping fight. And then Sigmar brings in this other group, the Udosis, by rescuing them from the Norse. Anyone else have a favorite?
I think the next one is he goes to kind of parlay with the Teutogens, and he marches his forces up to their what's called the Falschlag Rock, which is like this giant impenetrable spire fortress. And they go to the gate, and like I think they just pull their elevator up.
Can anyone tell us? So you're going to tell us about what they do there. Why do they automatically march from this battle with the Norsai to the Falschlag? Why are they targeting these guys?
If you recall from the second book, I believe that Sigmar has a bone to pick with these guys because they took advantage while Bjorn was gone with the army to raid Umberogan lands, and Sigmar got very upset, and he decided at that time that, hey, every village needs to have a stockade. We need to develop the militia system. We really need to organize and become better trained in all this. And it was because the Teutogens were taking advantage of the power vacuum that had been created when Bjorn had gone up to the north with the Umberogan army. And then Sigmar was like, I hate these guys. I'm going to go to their rock. And
specifically King Arthur.
Yes, King Arthur of the Teutogens.
Where could they have gotten that name?
Yeah, right?
I do think it is one of the things that I think that Graham McNeill did well in this book is express, even if it's in a condensed time period, express why or how the imperial idea became more developed, right? Like, why did they decide to have all the citizens able to fight? Why did they start having better weaponry? Why did they start developing this stronger horse culture? And it's because, they were connected with this other group that had horses, or the dwarves gave them this weaponry, or in this case, it was King Arthur and his forces had attacked, and they realized they needed to have all their people trained for even when all the soldiers are gone. So I think Graham McNeill did a good job on that, kind of showing here's the steps of how the empire developed into a culture that could be prepared for war.
Right.
On a counterpoint, he does describe King Arthur as having found the Falstag. Now, bear in mind, this is something, like Rock of Gibraltar size in the middle of the forest. If it took them that long to find it, the Teutons aren't the brightest of people. I think it's just a poor word choice there.
So anyway, he goes to kind of parlay with this king, and he refuses, kind of goes back up into his ivory tower, if you want to call it that. And so Sigmar says, okay, well, I'm just going to climb up there and talk to him face to face if they're not going to let me up.
I mean, that's what I would do, right? Like someone's in a big rock,
Right,
I'd be like, oh, well, I'll just go climb up and see them.
Yeah. And he brings along his champion, which I don't think we've mentioned before, but I believe it was Bjorn's champion before his. Alfgeir, is that his name? I can't remember.
Yeah.
So he kind of goes up with him. Not sure why, but maybe just to be a witness. I don't know. So they climb up to the top, and then he confronts and has a duel with this King Artur and beats him. And during their duel, he's also briefly like cast into the flames of Ulrich, which is like this never-ending flame that's at the top of the spire and comes out of it unscathed, which to like everyone that witnesses this happen is like, oh, it's a sign from the god, from Ulrich, that he's meant to be our king or whatever.
I'd just like to point out that any Dark Elf players should recognize that this makes Empire players superior.
If you want to start doing that, what eventually happens, that Flame of Ulrich, really implies that elves are superior to humans. So Teclis just grabs that flame with Ulrich, complaining about it and trying to use spectral wolves to stop him, and legs it with it in End Times, and that's the fall of Miedenheim right there.
Oh, I never read that.
So he just palms the flame and bounces.
He palms the flame, uses it to resurrect Tyrion as the incarnate of light, and then the penny drops that, hang on, the Doomsday device was under Miedenheim. I just destroyed the world, didn't I? I'm an idiot.
Well, so what you're saying is the elves may be superior in that they have the power to do that to the flame of Ulrich, but they weren't smart enough not to.
Not the wisdom.
Exactly. Right. No impulse control. Unlike most Warhammer players who have really good impulse control and don't own every army.
Anyways, can we talk about this Falschlag Rock thing for a second? Because I thought it was just like one of the most preposterous parts of the book. I mean, the way that the book describes the Falschlag Rock is like, you cannot see the top of it. And even when you're like halfway up it, you cannot see the top of it. And the notion that Sigmar is like 21, and yeah, I get the idea that he's like a superhero type of guy. Like, he's climbing up this thing like all Alex Honnold style, free solo, no equipment, no gear, and he's just going to climb to the top of it. First of all, how long does that take? Second of all, Alfgeir is doing it too, and he's got to be like 50, 60-year-old man who's definitely not a demigod. And like, how's he doing this too? Absolutely ridiculous.
I love that this is the part of the book that just beggars belief for you.
Beggars belief. There's no way. It makes no sense.
Beastmen, orcs, all this stuff, that's fine. Climbing rocks, I've never seen the like of that.
Yeah, impossible.
What do you mean you can't see the top?
So he beats this king in one-on-one combat, and he gains the oath or the vow from that guy's like champion that they will now follow him.
Right. It's important to note that the people who live in the Falschlagen, they recognize that their king has been acting in ways that are unsavory or immoral or dishonorable. I think probably is a better word, dishonorable. And they don't like it, but he's their king. And so when Sigmar defeats him, I can't remember the name of the guy.
It's Mirsa.
Mirsa, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, Mirsa the Eternal Warrior.
That's right. He has a knife to the throat of Sigmar and can kill him because Sigmar's so tired from this fight and the flames and climbing large rocks that he has his knife to him and he's going to kill him. And Sigmar basically says, "Hey, you said that I'm the type of guy you would want to follow." And Mirsa says, "Yeah, but are you going to enslave us?" And Sigmar says, "I'm not here to make a slave of any man." And so Mirsa pledges to him.
But I am here to kill your king.
Well, I mean, that's reasonable.
I feel like Mirsa probably swore an oath to protect Arthur at one point, but I don't know.
Arthur's dead. You can't protect someone after that.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of conversation between them where he was like, "Yes, you're the type of man I would follow, but I serve my king." So Sigmar removes the king portion of that equation.
And that's down at the bottom of the Falschlag. He's the one that tells Sigmar that Arthur is not going to come down and meet with him. And that's what Sigmar notes, that Mirsa is kind of disappointed about that. And he's like, "Hey, that seems kind of cowardly." And Mirsa's like, "Yeah, maybe it is." And Sigmar says, you should follow someone who's not cowardly like me, or something to that effect. And then Mirce is like, yeah, no, but I've sworn an oath and I'm going back. And he leaves. But then later he's the leader who's going to bring the Tutagen to serve Sigmar.
Yeah, there's very unsubtle undertones that Mirce is very sympathetic to Sigmar from the very beginning.
Yeah, you feel like everything he says, he just has like a big sigh after it.
So Sigmar goes back home. He goes to the Azaborn lands, and that's where these half Amazon, half Britons live, and he gains their loyalty through a consummation of a relationship with their queen, Freya. But who else has a favorite? What's something else that he does in this journey to get allies?
Actually, to go back to the Azaborns, there's the consummation, but it's also he gives them a huge tribute of weaponry and armor
and horses.
And Wolfgar calls him out, we're more powerful than them, why are we doing this? And Sigmar sort of has to try and explain without using any complicated terminology, because it's Wolfgar, that if we
very small words,
if we demonstrate that we can give this stuff away, they will assume we have an infinite amount of it and be terrified of us and think we are more powerful than we are. Political mind game stuff.
The Azerborns are eventually what becomes Stirland, and Stirland is known for being impoverished and basically being rubes. It kind of jives with kind of their ancient
that makes sense
thing they got going on here, where they live in holes under the ground.
I thought it was interesting that in the middle of all this, we also get a side plot where we're back to Garon, right? And in the middle of all these deeds with Sigmar going on, we're building up his greatest rival, the person who's dealt the most severe blow to him throughout his life. And we find Garon, who's escaped to the north, and he finds himself in the company of Cormac Bloodaxe, who is, if you're familiar with his figure in the lore at all, Cormac is the Chaos Lord who drives the deepest into the Empire beyond Archaon. I think everybody else more or less gets stopped at Prague. I guess Tamarkon kind of does this little detour through the Darklands and through the Border Princes and then comes up towards Nuln. But Cormac and Archaon are the only ones that are able to push as deep as they do. So Garon meeting up with this figure is kind of a big deal, and it's there that he acquires his name that most people would probably be familiar with him as Azazel, and it kind of sets him up as being the big bad of the next book, Empire.
Right. Girion is not done causing problems for Sigmar, but now he'll do it under a different name. And I'd like to just point this out, that any Chaos Warrior character who's not Archaon is more fascinating than Archaon. So it's a good reason to like these guys. Anyway, so they tell us that story. And then Sigmar goes and he has to fight the Thuringians. So he goes to fight against Otwin, the king of the Thuringians. And the Thuringians, by this time, Sigmar and his forces, all these allies, the Azaborn and the Tutagen and the Udosi, all of them far outnumber the Thuringians. And so Sigmar's really upset that the Thuringians are making him fight. He thinks that they should just join him. And I don't know exactly who. I don't remember if it's Pendrag or...
Are you talking about when he's talking to Alfgeir?
It's Alfgeir.
Alfgeir.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's talking to him and he's like, why are they fighting? And Alfgeir says, honor. And Sigmar's like, what do you mean? And Alfgeir says, if Otwin surrenders now and lets you dominate, he's going to lose his kingdom. They're going to say he's dishonorable and he shouldn't have done that. So he has to fight and prove that he's an honorable king, even though he knows he's going to lose. And then when you defeat him, then he can let you rule because you've defeated him. And Sigmar's just upset because that means, hundreds of men are going to die. And in Sigmar's vision, that's the worst thing possible because these men are going to be needed for the battle. And it plays out just like he says. And Otwin is defeated by Sigmar in combat, and Otwin surrenders, and Sigmar says, surrender to me and you'll survive. Otherwise, I'll drive your women and children from their homes. And so Otwin surrenders. So that's the way that he gets the Thuringians under his banner.
I think someone mentions to him that if the role were reversed and if Sigmar was being subjugated by a different tribe of men, would he accept that as well? I mean, this notion that these various tribes are just going to roll over and be Sigmar's subjects is just pretty nonsensical. I mean, these tribes are autonomous. They have rulers. They're not just going to give up their sovereignty because Sigmar asks them to.
Right.
But the hammer chose him.
It's true. They don't.
Did they hear about the hammer?
They don't have a hammer.
Not yet.
What's the next thing that happens?
The Witch of the Brackenwalsh kind of comes back to Sigmar in a vision and says, "Hey, you need to wrap this up because there's a mighty orc host coming, and you're going to need all of these tribes unified to do it."
At this point, Evan was also saying, "Graham McNeill, you need to wrap this up."
Yeah.
Get on with it.
Once the Witch of the Brackenwalsh visits Sigmar after he's come back to Reichdorf after subjugating the Thuringians, which becomes Middenland, we've seen Sigmar acquire provinces or tribes through various means so far. We've seen him do it through solo combat, like with Arthur. We've seen him do it through whatever he did with the Osborns regarding romance. We've seen him do it against Otwin with his tribe fighting his tribe. So we've seen various ways that Sigmar is uniting these tribes. And the next tribe that he has to go and try to figure out is the Burgundians, who are led by King Sigurd. And this is in the land what's going to become Averland in contemporary empire. These guys are a pretty wealthy tribe. Sigmar decides to go there by himself and try to figure out a way to win them over to his banner.
They also have a couple other tribes that follow them. It's not just Sigurd and the Burgundians.
Yeah, it's like a little triumvirate.
Yeah, there's the Merovingians and the Menegoths.
It's the Menegoths and the Merovingians. Yeah, who are, I guess, minor tribes that are kind of influenced by the Burgundians. So Sigmar heads out southeast towards Burgundia and goes to Sigurdheim, which is the capital of King Sigurd. King Sigurd meets with Sigmar and thinks he's really clever, and he's going to get Sigmar to accept a challenge that will most likely get Sigmar killed, and that way King Sigurd can rid himself of Sigmar without losing himself or any of his men in a costly war or anything.
They have a really interesting dialogue, too, about should men work together and how much can they trust each other. Sigurd suggests that you can't count on allies, or at least he can't count on Sigmar to actually help, because Sigmar doesn't have any self-interest in helping him. And Sigmar talks about when a neighbor has a fire, you put it out. And Sigurd says, well, yeah, but that's because if they have a fire, it's going to spread to your house. And then Sigmar says, yes, but after the fire, the neighbors still help rebuild the house of the person whose house was burned. I just thought it was an interesting dialogue. Do people help each other for reasons that are selfish, or do people help each other out of true altruism? And so it just shows you the different ways that Sigmar sees the world compared to others. Right? He sees it as true altruism. We should help each other even if there's no benefit for us.
Well, Sigmar has a very fascinating view of the world. I mean, in Sigmar's mind, he's self-appointed himself. He should be ruler of all of these men, and everyone else should be cool with it. And it comes as some sort of shock when they aren't. But from Sigurd's point of view, Sigurd's a treacherous guy. He's a cunning and sly type of dude. He's going to get Sigmar killed if he can. And so what he does is he requests that Sigmar go up into the mountains and defeat a beast that's been terrorizing the Burgundians. It's a dragon ogre known as Skaranarok, and it's plagued the people of this region for a while. And if you can do that, kind of the notion is that, Sigurd will bend the knee and accept Sigmar as his liege lord. So Sigmar goes up into the mountains, and he has this epic battle up in the mountains between himself and this dragon ogre, which is a pretty long and detailed scene about how he eventually kills it.
Super disappointed it's not a Shaggoth. Sigmar has fought all these battles and fought all these orcs, and then it's like, a dragon ogre. You can field these in units of 3, and there are 65 points. But Sigmar can barely beat this one. I don't know. I just wanted it to be a Shaggoth.
Well, this one's like one of the ancient, most venerable ones or something, so...
Point about that is Sigmar going to know that terminology? He might know what a dragon ogre is, and he might say, this is a big dragon ogre. He isn't going to sort of start saying, Are you 65 points or are you 260? Can I just clarify? You're pretty big. Are you strength 6 base? I can't tell from here. So it might be a Shaggoth, and it might simply be that if we are from Sigmar's perspective, he can't make that call and doesn't necessarily know there's that call to make.
Yeah, in my mind, I assumed it was a Shaggoth, but
It was interesting to me that this was Skoranorok's lairs in the Grey Mountains, which I didn't know dragon ogres were that far south. It's one of the only points in the book that kind of references what some of you had mentioned in the beginning, where it would have been cool if there was more here be monsters type of thing, as opposed to just here's greenskins and here's greenskins again and here's beastmen.
What I will point out in contrast to what point I've just made, later on in Blackfire Pass, Sigmar is going to struggle to take on a troll, and it is plausible that he spent this many pages fighting one dragon ogre.
Yeah, I've played with and against trolls many times on the tabletop, and they're not that good. I'll be real.
Certainly not when you've got Garl Morazna doing auto-wounding D3 wounds per hit.
But are they flaming?
They're not.
There you go.
He rolled all four pluses again. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter how powerful this character is.
If it was if Sigmar was written in Warhammer, he'd be like T4 with 3 wounds and a 4-up ward save or something. He'd die to like some sort of ballista skill shooting, like in turn 2.
You've just described Valton, which is Sigmar.
but he's got that rule that lets him never die.
So Sigurd, confesses to Sigmar after Sigmar's brought the head of Skoranorok back down the mountain and says, "Oh, I was so duplicitous and trying to, cunningly get you to die, but now I feel really bad, and now I'm gonna join your empire." And then Sigmar goes back to Reichdorf.
He goes back. When he gets there, everyone's happy to see him, and he says, "Hey, I know I fooled you when I left to go there because you didn't want me to go by myself, but I tricked you and left. Ha ha ha." And then when he gets there, though, there's a messenger from the not Ostrogoths, from the Ostagoths, Galen Veneva, who is there and says, "Hey, orcs are attacking us, are attacking the Ostagoths, and King Adelhard is requesting help." Sigmar is like, "Okay, go back, tell him we'll help." And so Alaric says to Sigmar, "Actually, we've kind of got part of this handled. They're not going to be attacked until you get there. The Slayer King of Zufbar is going to be stopping the orcs from coming through and attacking them." But then they do ultimately go up there to Ostagoth, and they defeat the orcs at this bridge. I think it's important that it's a bridge again. But they defeat the orcs there. And so now, basically, almost all of the tribes of man, all but 2, joined Sigmar. And so they have something called the Council of the 11.
It was incredibly forgettable.
So
I honestly forgot about it.
they don't want to follow Sigmar. The basic gist is Sigmar says, for us to win, not only do we have to be united as 11 kings working together, we have to have singular unity in our leadership. So you have to give control of your soldiers to me. And all of them at first say no. And then Sigmar basically says, "Well, then fine. I'm not going to come out of Bergen lands, and I'm going to let you all die. And then we'll die." And then Marbad, who's Bjorn's closest ally, says, "No, I will give you command." And then Adelhard does. And then Wolfila, who's the queen, she says she will. And the last one is actually Merda of the Tutagens. And so they say, "We'll unite under Sigmar." And so essentially they're recognizing Sigmar's authority. And that leads us to Blackfire Pass.
One side note before we get to that, I just had this in my notes, that when Sigmar is on his way back from the Burgundians after he kills the dragon ogre, says he's ridden for Reichdorf through a pastoral landscape of golden cornfields. And I was like, oh, they have corn apparently.
I mean, that suggests that they've made contact with Lustria or with
exactly
the not Americas, and the totally not Columbian exchange has occurred. So they have corn and potatoes.
Right, exactly.
This is actually worth pointing out before we go further down this road. Corn in actual old world parlance refers to grain in this context as opposed to maize.
Oh, yeah, I always forget about that. Bummer.
I ran into this when trying to study trade in the 1800s a while back. It gets really confusing unless you realise that the two things are the same word but different crops.
Well, that's just stupid.
Sorry. I ruined that. He's not riding through Iowa.
At this time, Sigmar is 26, so the book begins when he's 15. The transformation and the development of these tribes just in the span of 11 years is super incredible. Like population booms 10 times over, and dock facilities, and just like all the types of things that you see are just pretty remarkable with regards to the development of these tribes and their manufacturing capacities.
And there's reference to the household having to save up so the man that they are sending to war can have armor. So Pendrag and Alaric have got to the point where they are producing armor on an industrial scale, and it is now affordable to local peasant farmer family number B. So they've essentially destroyed the economic value of armor within that 10 years as well.
Yeah, that was something we didn't really touch on, but it's kind of important in the beginning of the book, is that Alaric takes Pendrag under his wing and shows him the metal working, not all the secrets of the dwarves, but gives them enough skill to equip the humans and teach other humans how to become blacksmiths and make steel weapons and steel armor and barding for horses. So the dwarves have given Pendrag this ability. He's also passed it on. So like every town and village now has the ability to make armor and better weapons, and so the military capacity of the tribes is exponentially grown over the course of the last 10 years with this new knowledge.
The author does make a point, it seems like, at the beginning of each battle throughout the book, of kind of going over where they are technologically and describing their armor and what weapons they're using. And like you said, I think by the end of the last battle we have here, they're talking about the barding on the horses, that sort of stuff. So
yeah, so just in the course of 11 years, we go from cloth armor and scythes, very primitive equipment.
They didn't even have stirrups on their horses.
Yeah.
This is really just telling us how impressive the dwarfs are. I mean, they can teach that well.
We've got like 800 years of human history and development in like 10 years in the Empire.
Sigmar fighting naked to Sigmar with full plate.
Sigmar's still fighting naked, I think, but I think that's just a choice thing.
Personal choice, yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't have to.
The surprising thing is, if I was going to go looking for advice on stirrups and horse armor, I wouldn't ask a dwarf.
Now, I think there was one of the tribes that had already developed that technology independently.
So we're heading into Blackfire Pass?
We are.
Yep.
Urgluk Bloodfang.
Brian, tell us about Urgluk.
Urgluk Bloodfang is, of course, a war leader from the Badlands who's pushing into the Empire, has a host capable of destroying all the realms of men. He has a really cool wyvern.
And a glowing axe.
That's right,
Ooh,
yes.
Glowing axe.
Did they mention that some of the runes on Galmaraz are the same runes that were on his weapon, meaning that that was a dwarven weapon that he had stolen?
Ooh, I didn't notice that. So what's Sigmar's plan?
So we're going to stand in the pass with mountains on either side and let them come to us.
Yeah, this is kind of a classic outnumbered force funnels their enemy into a position where their superior numbers can't be used to their benefit because the geography is so confined that you're going to have to face your enemy on relatively even numbers.
Which works great until you remember that he's got a massive chariot contingent with him, which doesn't generally work very well in Thermopylae. And you remember that the enemy has spider riders who can just flank him anyway. The spider riders get like a one-line mention and get thrown away without this turning into anything, just to tick the box. But this battle is a slog to read, or it was for me, and it is because there's so many missed opportunities that are replaced with, and now they killed some more orcs.
It is just your standard, the chariots charge in and these wild barbarian berserkers charge in, and then Sigmar hits some people with hammer, and things are going great, and then things aren't going great.
Then there's a piece of the line that's faltering.
Graham McNeill doesn't really demonstrate skill in making combat visceral. It's very much as if you're looking at the battle, the Warhammer table from 6 feet above. You're not really feeling the die rolls, as it were. You're not feeling the people falling. It's very much big picture, which Dark Age combat really wasn't. You should feel the swords going in. You should feel them hitting bone. It should feel like it's a very animalistic encounter, and here it's almost you're just deleting people by tapping buttons.
I think it's interesting when you think about combat like this. You would be completely exhausted basically within like 5 minutes. And they talk about how these guys are like fighting all day. And I don't know if it's humanly or physically possible to exert that much energy over that period of time.
It is if you can climb a Fauschlag.
And you can do that by rotating your soldiers around, but that's this kind of practical detail that isn't really mentioned. Your front rank goes to the back and has a rest, and your more people come in, and this is the sort of thing you do after a unit of orcs has broken. But we're not that detailed here. Quite vague and quite generic. We get mentions of goblin archers. We get one mention of trolls, but it's generally mob of orc boys charges.
There's a wyvern.
There is, and there's a mention of what appear to be black orcs, which only came into existence in the Great Revolt 100 years before this. And they don't really get any focus. They get this one mention, and it's, come on, Graham, you can expand on some of these interesting bits more than just have another group of orcs charging get massacred.
I mean, so we have this description of the battle that hits, here's the different unit types in an orc army book. But ultimately, Sigmar's forces are being pushed back, and he's in trouble. And he knows he needs to do something to win.
And he decides to stop channeling Charlemagne and start channeling Samson, and jumps off a big rock and proceeds to kill over 100 orcs single-handed while surrounded by them. We leave the historical Sigmar and go into the biblical patriarch judge Sigmar. Where this is the Sigmar that massacres 10,000 Skaven with an ox jawbone. As per Wilhelm, the Dogs of War special character, his magic item is the jawbone that Sigmar uses just to murder every Skaven that ever came near him.
I didn't know that they actually have someone using the jawbone of an ass to murder Skaven instead of Philistines.
This is why the Samson comparison is very apt. Yes, Sigmar is untouchable. He can just take on the entire orc army solo and kill them one at a time. He can do this all day.
I mean, Graham McNeill writes this as if this is a risk. He jumps off this rock into the middle of the orc army at a moment when his forces are about to collapse. His men, seeing him, are so invigorated by love for him, by recognizing his power, all that stuff, that they charge forward too. And ultimately, this turns the tide of the battle. The orcs go, oh, we were winning, and now the humans are, pushing forward, and the dwarfs that are with them, because the High King actually, I think, comes to this battle. But they're pushing forward, and now it kind of breaks the morale of the orcs, and this leads to the beginning of the end of the battle, and the orcs flee, and they're defeated.
Just leadership 5.
So humans have been saved.
No, we've got a wyvern left.
Oh, that's right. Okay, well, what happens?
It depends on which version. So in the novel, it flies in, and Sigmar kills the wyvern and then brains the warlord. And he says a bit of a speech about it. Someone who is more reverent might want to say that again, but as if... Yeah, actually, does someone want to describe that scene?
Clearly, I don't even remember the scene, so I probably shouldn't describe it.
My notes ended at page 326.
He says you will never win.
I'm looking forward to the alternative, actually.
Okay, in the life of Sigmar, The Wyvern flies in, and Sigmar he's out of it now. He has done his Samson bit, but he is exhausted. He cannot raise his hammer again. And one by one, like one standard mook from each tribe rushes in to save him and takes another chunk out of the Wyvern. Or, also simultaneously, but describes it, one at a time. And the Wyvern then falls on the war boss and pins him.
Oh,
And it is this big symbolic thing of, actually, we've had the time of heroes to forge the empire. It is now the time of men to hold it together and work together.
oh, I like that.
Oh, see, that's way better.
It is. It's a bit of an Oleanus pious moment if there were 12 of them and they all dogpiled Horus, and that's how they won.
Now you're referencing 30K, and I have no idea what's going on. The Empire is created in that moment. Sigmar is recognized as the leader of the Empire.
Got the various provinces and what becomes the Electric Counts. And Kurgan, after the end of the battle, King Kurgan says he'll make the Empire a gift and give each one of them a special weapon, which becomes the Rune Fangs, which symbolize their authority over their province.
Which I chose to be Alric's punishment. And let me explain. Kurgan volunteers Alric to make the finest swords ever made. Now, bear in mind that for a dwarf, that's a very serious promise. And he's going to make one of these finest swords ever made for each of the future Elector Counts. It takes Alric 100 years to do this. What King Kurgan is doing is removing Alric from the board as a piece for a century. And the way I interpreted this is that the King Kurgan has now seen the consequences of giving technology and all this help to the Empire, to the humans, to the different tribes. And what he's going to do is put the brakes on that.
Ooh.
He's going to take Alric off the board.
Low in the roll.
You are not going to be giving Pendrag tips on steel manufacturing anymore. If the humans continue on this trajectory, they are going to overtake us technologically, and the dwarves are going to be irrelevant within a few hundred years.
Sneaky dwarfs. Sneaky dwarf.
Again, that is my analysis of the dwarf geopolitical situation. There isn't that much in the book that supports that, but that's just how I interpreted King Kurgan's decision.
All these are Kerry's theories, all right? I don't read the situation.
Oh, Kerry theories, in quotes. We're going to have a section of the podcast called Kerry Theories.
It does mention that I think you're right, Kerry, when kind of tasks him with forging the Rune Fangs, that it says something about Alaric gives him like a funny look or something because he like knows how serious of a charge it is.
Isn't it an insult of some sort to make him forge swords? Because aren't dwarves against swords?
It seems like most of their weapons are also tools. So swords are kind of...
it feels like a sword it's like a slight. Like, ooh, I wouldn't forge swords. Like, that's for elves.
Actually, Mike's made a great point about it being an insult. Not necessarily because it's the swords, but if you know your Dwarf Army book, you know that you've got the rule of pride. Making the same sword 11, 12 times with the same rune combination is a massive no-no when it comes to rune crafting.
Ooh, yeah, point.
If we continue down this Kerry theory rabbit hole, Kurgan's not only saying, take
Let's expand on that.
100 years of your life, forget about it. You've now got a different job. We've also got, you are going to essentially be ostracized from the Runesmith Guild.
I love it. I love Kerry theories. These are the best theories ever.
I mean, you can imagine Alric's mindset after 100 years of having to do this punishment. This now explains why he's mad and why he decides to put the Rune of Eternity on a lump of warpstone.
Uh-oh, now you're getting into stuff I don't know about that we'll have to talk about later.
Nemesis Crown Campaign, 7th edition.
Oh, that was right when I got into war.
It was an awful campaign.
It's like the least remarkable campaign of the last 20 years.
I do remember that. I remember it being a big deal and then everyone being like, so let's just play regular games.
Yeah.
So let's do our final thoughts. Someone tell me what this taught you about the Warhammer world.
Through the power of friendship, anything is possible.
As long as you're willing to sacrifice your friends to some orcs. Is that no? Yes? Is that what we learned?
Sometimes you're going to have to murder some people to make them your friends.
I thought it was interesting to read a formative book because so much of the Black Library is set in, contemporary Empire times. But I think one is about enough.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it was interesting to just hear about Sigmar and his life and how things got set up. Yeah, so I think just generally that, and then seeing like character of the different provinces. If I knew more about each of the provinces in the current imperial time, then I'd probably get more from knowing about them in this time. But since I don't know Stirland from Reichland from Midland, it was less. But I do think it was helpful in that way. I joke, but it was helpful.
This guy's supposed to be our leader.
I mean, that's just by force. I'm like Sigmar. You have to follow me because I've got a hammer. So what are you going to do? It's destiny.
I'm kind of in the same boat. I don't really know the individualities of each of the provinces, so it was kind of cool to see, you know, the barbarians or the riders and all that type of stuff kind of come together and in very quick succession.
I do think the origins of the relationship between the dwarfs and the humans was good to know, like how that happened. So if people don't know about that, this does tell you.
A lot of it was general lore that you'll learn like in the 6th edition rulebook or stuff like this, kind of like very briefly in a few paragraphs. It'll tell you about the origin between the men and the dwarves, but it obviously gets a lot more detailed with the various tribes and the actual formation story.
This book establishes, beyond all reasonable doubt, that orcs eat humans. The original Witch of the Brackenwold is put in a pot and boiled and eaten by orc raiders. Put that into context of, you know, war, back to Ravenna's idea of if only we didn't go to war and didn't have to go to war. No, they're going to come and kill you and eat.
Right.
That's a good reason to go to war.
Whether orcs ate humans or not, was that an open question?
It's not usually referenced directly. We get it a little bit in some 40k stuff, but it's not something they focus on massively.
Over the years, I don't remember ever reading a story where the orcs explicitly ate the dead.
That's more of an ogre thing.
But this book, we have the orcs put the human witch in a pot, cook her, eat her.
Maybe it was just those orcs. Maybe those are cannibal orcs.
Why are they the exception? Why do we want them to be the exception? All right, so I'm guessing that the original hag in a pot was not your favorite character. So who's your favorite character? Brian, you get first shots. Who's your favorite?
My favorite character, I actually liked Alaric a lot. He was just a fun character to read in the middle of the sections that he pops up in.
Evan.
I actually liked the hag because I
'Cause you
thought
were hungry?
it was the
Actually, the
No.
hag was my favorite.
no the just because she actually like had a plot through line through the whole book.
She kept it 100 for sure.
You did get to know her a little bit, how she sees herself and her role, but like she knows her future.
Yeah, and they go into the backstory of the hags of the Bracken Walsh a little bit, and you get a little bit of like sympathy for them. And they're kind of mysterious and fun. So I think there's not a lot of mystery in the narration of this book. So that's one part that's kind of fun and mysterious.
Carrie?
I think Alaric could probably be my favourite, but I'll focus, I think, on Kurgan Ironbeard, just for all of those Kerry theory rationales that I've already put in.
All right.
No, we've done enough helping the humans now. Let's dial it back a notch before we take it too far.
All right, Mike?
Yeah, I don't have a favorite character. I didn't think anyone stood out to me as particularly compelling as a favorite or super interesting. Back in Drachenfels when we read that, I thought Detlef was like by far my favorite character. So I do have favorite characters in books, but I don't think anybody in Heldenhammer was really calling to me.
Yeah, I do think I agree with Mike in that all the characters were fairly straightforward. Right? Like you didn't get just a ton of character development.
Personality.
Yeah, it was pretty straightforward. I guess if I were to say who I'm interested in seeing do a little bit more, although Wolfgart was like portrayed as unthinking and brutish in some ways, he restrained or helped guide Sigmar as much as Pendrag or more. And so he ended up more thoughtful than maybe you would have thought. So I think in the next two books of the Sigmar series, he might have some stuff that would be interesting. So
Plus, he's a married man.
Oh, yeah. Mabe or something like that. She chose him, just say. All right, well, we have two more questions. If you were to make an army or a special character or a battle scenario from this book, what would it be?
I mean, I'd quite like to see it's really hard not to say Age of Sigma for this, a Sigma time period human army list. I know Armies Project did bandy that idea around about 10 years ago, and then it got dropped from the to-do list and then never came back. But it would be interesting to fight something like Blackfire Pass with this mix of units, with human chariots, with berserkers, with a bit less technology available, but potentially some boosted stats, sort of Marauder style, on your sort of more visceral combat troops as opposed to guys in puffy pajamas.
Anyone else?
Maybe some sort of mode where you're climbing the Farschlag rock.
Oh, I want to play this with Mike. I'm going to make Mike play that one with me.
What happens if the defenders just start emptying chamber pots on your head? It's going to be very slippery rock.
And have a crappy day.
Oh dear.
Mike, what about you?
I don't know. It's hard to think of something given the fact that Warhammer Fantasy Battles is set 2,500 years in the future, and we don't really have a corollary between extremely primitive human tribes and armies that we can play from. So, I don't know. Didn't really have a good answer for it.
All right. Well, I know for me, I thought that the Battle of Astafan Bridge would be really cool, where you have maybe some sort of settlement or whatever, and there's some troops inside it that are holding off a lot of orcs, and the orcs are trying to get in, and then at the same time, there's some human cavalry coming from the rear and attacking them. So can you force all the orcs to turn around and face you so that the humans inside this settlement survive? So I think those types of scenarios where you have a goal of helping someone survive and it's against overwhelming odds at some points, I think those can be kind of fun.
Can your unit champion named Trinovantes do a challenge for one round and soak up a round of combat?
That's right.
Dying heroically.
Ryan, have you ever used the siege rules out of the Blood in the Badlands supplement?
No, I've not.
I have, yeah.
I'd recommend it. You could basically do that just with those rules that already exist, with the relief force coming in to try and save the day.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to try that sometime.
There's been various scenarios that I've seen in White Dwarf battle reports from back in the day with similar kind of themes of like you take 2,000 point army, your opponent has a 4,000 point army, and you basically have to
survive long enough.
Survive for a certain amount of time or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen some battle reports with those.
The beauty of this is you could just both turn up with your standard 2,000, 2,400 point battle, use these rules, you don't have to change your army list at all.
I was kind of thinking that like a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay supplement based on the Grey Vaults that Sigmar and Bjorn found themselves in would be kind of cool.
That is cool.
Do you play that?
I don't. I'm open to playing it. I don't know when I would have time to ever play it. I probably don't have time to play it, but it would be cool to like read about, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. I mean, you could even do undead type of spirit army or demons versus humans. I mean, in some way, I'm not sure exactly how, but I think you could
ghost humans.
Especially, use some of those AOS models. Not everyone likes plastic models here, Mike, but you could use some of those.
I don't like AOS models either.
You could use some of those.
AOS plus plastic. You don't stand a chance.
All right, last question. There were 11 tribes that fought at Blackfire Pass. One tribe refused to come. We didn't mention them, but the Jutones didn't come, and the Bretonni didn't come, and then I think later they're going to flee to become the Bretonnians. But of the 11 tribes that fought, how many tribes would you give this book in rating it?
4.
Whew, okay, 4 tribes. I'm not going to make you name the tribes. So tell me something you liked about it.
I like that it tried to cover a period that, while there was sort of, lore about, there hadn't really been much of a human element to. So I liked its ambition.
Okay. All right, someone else. How many tribes out of the 11?
I'd probably give it a 6 myself. I enjoyed it enough for what it was. It was just the Legend of Sigmar, even with its ridiculous bits. It was a delve into an era of the setting that I was wholly unfamiliar with, so I kind of enjoyed it from that point of view.
Okay.
I'll give it a 6 as well. 1 for every month it took me to read it.
All right.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to give it a 4. I didn't really enjoy it too much. The problem, it's 408 pages, I think, and it's very long, but it's also not very deep. The dialogue is very kind of like Marvel Universe levels of kind of cheesy, kind of cliche, basically the entire time. And the characters are all stereotypes, and they're not very interesting or deep. And I appreciate some of the lore from like the origin perspective, but with regards to good solid literature, I didn't think it was very good.
All right. Well, I'm going to give it a 7 because as I read this book, I was never feeling compelled to come back and read it so that I could get to the end of it, find out what happens. But I don't think that's the author's fault. And at the same time, there was nothing where I said, I just don't want to read this book. It didn't always feel compelling that I wanted to come to it, but it never felt like I said, I think that I can't go back to it because of this. And I did like getting to know the lore, and I did like seeing the development of the empire, and I did like seeing the different cultural aspects and seeing how his conquest or his gaining the connection with each province related to that province specifically, right? So was it prowess? Was it honor? Was it wealth? What was it that drew them? Protection. So I did enjoy that. So that's why I'm giving it 7. All right. Any thoughts before we go? As you may have noticed, the Heardstone is going through a cycle where we, every other month, we talk about an army book, and then we talk about a Black Library book. So we've talked about a Black Library book today. Our next book will be the next produced army book, which is, who wants to tell them?
Oh, is it Skaven?
It is. It's the rats. So be prepared to be stabbed in the back, to get sick, to be blasted with lightning, and to be stitched together into a giant rat in our next army book.
And to read 12 pages of FAQ.
So that's what we'll be doing in our next episode of The Heardstone. Make sure to visit us at the Discord. Send us any feedback you have. Visit us on Twitter, and thanks for listening. All right, well, that's all we have for today. We hope that next month you'll gather around the Heardstone with us again. Well, I'll have to cut that, Kerry. Come on.
lowering
The
the
werewolves, not
tone.
swearwolves.
Yeah.
I thought Evan was the troublemaker.
Sorry. I can be if you want.
And now my memory, I've lost. Who's the fruit fly guy? Anyone remember from biology class? No. Blast. Okay.
Jeff Goldblum.
It was a brilliant analogy. He's the fruit fly and like the tulip bulbs or something. I don't remember. Mendel. It's it. That's it. Maybe it's Mendel.
You can always look it up and reinsert it later.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna go with
like you.
Or perhaps. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll cut this off. Kerry, who's the queen that rebelled against the English or against the Romans?
Boudica.
Yeah. So I picked up tones of Boudica from her, and I'm totally going to set that in as if I remembered her name, and I'm going to cut out Kerry reminding me.
Not a problem.
All right, well, that's all we have for today. We hope that next month you'll gather around the Heardstone with us again.